This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I'm still struggling to make sense of what happened 6 days ago in the Carpathian Mountains. I've always been an avid hiker and camper, and nothing in my previous experiences prepared me for this. I'm writing this down partly to process it, partly to see if anyone else has encountered something similar. My friends, Mia, Alex, and Daniel, and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We'd chosen a remote area in the Carpathians, known for its pristine forests and spectacular views. The four of us have been doing summer camping trips together since university, but this was our first time in Romania. The drive up was gorgeous. Winding mountain roads, dense forests, and that crisp mountain air that makes you feel alive. We parked at a small clearing designated for hikers and trekked about 3 hours to reach our intended camping spot. The location was perfect. A grassy meadow surrounded by pine trees with a small stream about 50 meters away. The only strange thing was the amount of cow pats scattered across the field, but we figured local farmers might let their cattle graze there occasionally. "This looks like cow country," Alex had said, pointing at the droppings, "but I don't see any fences or farms nearby." Daniel just shrugged. "Free fertilizer. Let's just find a clean spot for the tents." We set up camp in the late afternoon. 2 tents, mine shared with Mia and the guys in the other. We collected firewood, prepared dinner, and spent the evening chatting around the campfire. Everything was absolutely normal. The stars were incredible that night, the kind of clear sky you only get away from city lights. I remember feeling so at peace. We turned in around 11 at night. I fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from the hike and the fresh air. The sound woke me up first. It was still dark. My phone said it was just past 4 in the morning. At first, I thought it was thunder, this low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate the ground beneath our tent. But then I recognized it as hoofbeats. Lots of hoofbeats. "Mia," I whispered, shaking her awake. "Do you hear that?" She sat up, rubbing her eyes. "What the hell is that noise?" The hoofbeats grew louder, and then we heard it, a deep, guttural bellow that sounded nothing like any cow I'd ever heard. It was lower, more resonant, and it made the hair on my arms stand up. I unzipped our tent just enough to peek outside. The dim pre-dawn light revealed a sight that made my stomach drop. Our campsite was being surrounded by cows, not just a few, dozens of them, moving in a coordinated pattern around our camp. But what drew my eye immediately was the bull. It stood at least 7 feet tall at the shoulder, pure white with a massive chest and thick neck. Its horns curved outward and up, spanning what must have been over a meter. But it was its eyes that terrified me. They were fixed directly on our tents with an unnatural focus. "Guys!" I whisper-shouted toward the other tent. "Wake up!" Alex's head popped out of their tent. "Holy shit," he muttered, taking in the scene. The bull stood perfectly still while the cows continued circling. I've seen farm animals before, and this wasn't normal behavior. They moved too precisely, too coordinated. The bull hadn't blinked once since I'd spotted it. "What do we do?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "Stay calm," Daniel said, now awake too. "They're probably just curious. They'll move on." But they didn't move on. The bull took a step forward, its hoofs striking the ground with what seemed like deliberate force. Then another step. The cows had formed a perfect circle around our camp now, and they'd stopped moving. That's when the bull did something I'll never forget. It lowered its head and let out a sound that wasn't a normal bull noise. It was deeper, almost like it came from somewhere beneath the earth. Then, without warning, it charged straight at Daniel and Alex's tent. Alex managed to scramble out just as the bull hit. Daniel wasn't so lucky. He was still inside when the bull's massive head connected with the tent, flattening one side completely. I heard Daniel scream, a panicked pain sound that will haunt me forever. "Daniel!" Alex yelled, running toward the collapsed tent. Somehow, Daniel crawled out from under the fabric, his face pale, clutching his arm. The bull had already backed up, preparing for another charge. "Get to the trees!" I screamed, grabbing our backpacks and pulling Mia out of our tent. We all started running toward the tree line, but the cows shifted, blocking our path. They weren't acting aggressively. They simply moved in front of us, forcing us back toward the center of the clearing. We changed direction 3 times, but the outcome was always the same. The cows were herding us. Meanwhile, the bull had returned to Daniel and Alex's collapsed tent. It hooked its horns under the fabric and tossed it into the air like it weighed nothing. The tent landed several meters away, torn and mangled. Our cooking gear went flying next as the bull methodically destroyed our campsite. We huddled together near my tent, which was still standing. Daniel was breathing hard, holding his arm awkwardly. "It's not broken," he said through gritted teeth. "Just bruised. That thing barely touched me." "What the hell is happening?" Mia whispered. "This isn't normal." She was right. I'd grown up in a rural area and had seen plenty of farm animals. Bulls can be territorial, but this was different. The white bull wasn't acting out of aggression or fear. It seemed purposeful. After destroying the guy's tent and scattering our supplies, it turned and stared at us again, completely still, except for the steam billowing from its nostrils in the cool morning air. Alex tried making loud noises to scare them off. He clapped, yelled, even threw a small rock near, not at, one of the cows. They didn't react at all. The bull just kept staring at us with those unblinking eyes. "My phone has no signal," I said, checking desperately. Everyone else confirmed the same. For the next 4 hours, we remained trapped in that meadow. The sun rose fully, but the animals didn't move. We tried approaching the tree line twice more, but each time the cows shifted to block our path. We were prisoners in the middle of a mountain meadow, surrounded by silent bovine guards, led by an unnaturally large white bull that periodically destroyed another piece of our campsite whenever one of us tried to make a break for it. Around 8 in the morning, Daniel noticed something odd. "They're not eating," he said quietly. "Look at all this grass. Cows should be grazing, but they're just standing there." He was right. Not a single cow had lowered its head to graze. They simply stood, facing us, completely still except for the occasional tail swish or ear flick. The most terrifying aspect was the feeling of intelligence behind it all. Every move we made was countered. When we gathered our remaining supplies and tried moving as a group toward the stream, thinking the cows might not follow us through water, the herd shifted seamlessly to block the path. The bull would take a single step in our direction, and we'd freeze in place. "This isn't random," Mia whispered at one point. "They're keeping us here deliberately." Around 9:30, something changed. A different sound echoed through the valley, a distant bell. The cows' ears all twitched simultaneously, and for the first time in hours, they shifted their gaze away from us. The white bull let out another of those unnatural bellows, and slowly the herd began to move away. They didn't scatter randomly as you'd expect from animals. They moved in the same coordinated pattern they'd arrived in, heading toward the eastern end of the meadow. The bull was the last to leave. It turned away from us, but then stopped and looked back over its shoulder directly at me. I will never forget the feeling that washed over me in that moment. The absolute certainty that it recognized me specifically, that it would remember me. It held my gaze for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, then continued after its herd. We didn't wait to see if they'd return. We grabbed what remained of our belongings and practically ran in the opposite direction. Daniel's arm was badly bruised but functional. Our destroyed tent and most of our cooking gear had to be abandoned. We hiked for 3 hours without stopping, putting as much distance as possible between us and that meadow. When we finally found another suitable campsite, none of us wanted to stop, but exhaustion forced our hand. That night, huddled in our single remaining tent, we tried to make sense of what happened. Maybe they were protecting a calf, Alex suggested. There were no calves, I said, and that doesn't explain how they kept us contained so effectively. Perhaps they were trained somehow, Daniel offered, like some farmer's weird security system. But we all knew that was ridiculous. No one could train an entire herd of cows with that level of coordination. We made it back to civilization the next day and reported the incident to local authorities. The officer just shrugged and said, "Many strange things happen in these mountains. The old people have stories." But he wouldn't elaborate, no matter how much we pressed. I've been researching ever since we got back, looking into local folklore, asking on forums about unusual animal behavior in the region. Most people think we're exaggerating or that we encountered a territorial bull and panicked. But they weren't there. They didn't see the unnatural stillness of that white bull, the way it seemed to look through you rather than at you. I still wake up at night hearing that deep, resonant bellow. Sometimes I swear I can feel the ground vibrating beneath my bed, like distant hoofbeats approaching. I don't know what happened in those mountains, but I'm certain of one thing. Whatever surrounded us that morning wasn't just a herd of ordinary cows. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see that white bull staring back at me, as if it's waiting for our paths to cross again. Story 2. I still get chills when I look at our backyard fence. It's been rebuilt now, but I know exactly where it happened. Every time I mow the lawn, I feel this weird sense of gratitude mixed with absolute terror when I pass that spot. My wife says I should probably talk to someone about it, but I figured writing it all down might help instead. This happened back in May of 2020, right in the middle of all that COVID lockdown insanity. We'd been stuck in our house in rural East Texas for what felt like forever. Me, my wife Lisa, and our 10-year-old daughter Emma. We were going absolutely stir-crazy by that point. Working from home, virtual school, the same walls day after day. You know how it was. One Friday afternoon, I was finishing up some work emails when Emma came bounding into my home office with this whole plan for a backyard camping night. She'd been watching some YouTube videos about staycations and was convinced this would fix our lockdown blues. Lisa thought it was a great idea too. Dad, can we sleep in the tent tonight, please?" Emma was practically vibrating with excitement. "We can make s'mores on the fire pit and tell ghost stories and everything." I couldn't say no when they were both so excited about it. And honestly, I was desperate for anything that felt different from our routine. So I agreed, and we spent the afternoon getting everything ready. I dug our old 4-person tent out of the garage. It was dusty but seemed intact. We had this perfect spot picked out for it, this flat area at the back of our yard where our property line runs along a T intersection. Our neighborhood's pretty quiet, especially since lockdown, so we weren't worried about noise from cars or anything. I spent a couple hours setting everything up, getting the tent secured, arranging our sleeping bags, even stringing up some solar-powered fairy lights Emma insisted we needed. Lisa and Emma brought out snacks and drinks and extra blankets. We were all genuinely excited about it, which seems silly now looking back. It was just sleeping in the backyard. But after months of monotony, it felt like a real adventure. We'd planned to head out there around 8 after dinner. Lisa made burgers on the grill, and we were all in good spirits. Around 7, though, Emma started saying she didn't feel well. "My tummy hurts," she said, pushing her plate away. She looked a little pale, and when Lisa felt her forehead, she said Emma felt warm. "Maybe we should postpone camping night," Lisa suggested. And of course, Emma started to protest immediately. "No, I'm fine, I want to camp." But within 30 minutes, she'd thrown up, and that was that. No camping tonight. I remember feeling weirdly disappointed as I took down the tent in the fading light. Emma was crying from her bedroom window, watching me dismantle our adventure. Lisa gave her some children's Tylenol and tucked her into her real bed instead of a sleeping bag. "We'll do it next weekend," I promised as I kissed Emma goodnight. "When you're feeling better." The rest of the evening was normal. Lisa and I watched some Netflix show I can't even remember now, and we all went to bed around 11. Emma was sleeping peacefully, no fever anymore, which made me think it might have just been some brief bug, or maybe even excitement making her stomach upset. I fell asleep quickly that night, worn out from the day and the disappointment. I remember having some mundane dream about work when the sound hit. It was 12:32 exactly. I know because I looked at the clock the moment I jolted awake. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. A massive crash, the screech of metal, breaking, glass, and this terrible splintering noise. Our whole house seemed to shake with it. Lisa and I both sat straight up in bed. "What the hell was that?" she gasped, clutching my arm so hard her nails dug in. Before I could answer, we heard another sound. A car horn, stuck on, blaring continuously from somewhere very close. Then Emma was in our doorway, crying, "Daddy, what's happening?" I grabbed my phone for the flashlight and told Lisa and Emma to stay inside. I threw on my slippers and ran to our back door, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. When I looked out the window, I couldn't process what I was seeing at first. Our back fence was just gone. Where there had been a 6-foot privacy fence, there was now splintered wood scattered everywhere, and sitting in our backyard, horns still blaring, headlights pointing crazily up into the sky, was a car. A dark-colored sedan, steam pouring from its crumpled hood. I fumbled with my phone, calling 911 with shaking fingers while I stepped out onto our back porch. The dispatcher asked me what my emergency was, and I remember struggling to explain. "There's a car in my backyard. It crashed through my fence. I don't know if anyone's hurt." As I was speaking, I saw movement. The driver's door of the car pushed open with a metallic groan, and a man stumbled out. Even from the porch, I could tell something wasn't right about him. He was moving wrong, jerky, uncoordinated movements. He fell to his knees, then got back up. "Sir, are there any injuries?" the dispatcher was asking. "I don't know yet," I said, my voice barely audible over the still blaring horn. "The driver is out of the car." I raised my voice to call out to him. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need an ambulance?" The man's head snapped toward me. He was maybe in his mid-20s, with a scruffy beard and what looked like a baseball cap, though it was hard to see clearly in the mix of moonlight and the car's headlights. He stared at me for a second, then started walking toward our porch. but something about his walk made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't the walk of someone seeking help after an accident. "Sir," the dispatcher said in my ear, "are you still there?" "Yes," I whispered, backing up toward our door. "I think the driver might be drunk or something. He's coming toward my house now. He doesn't look right." "Police are on their way," she assured me. "Is your family safe?" I glanced behind me to see Lisa and Emma watching from inside. Emma clutching her stuffed rabbit, Lisa with her arm protectively around her shoulders. "Get back from the windows," I called to them. "Go to the bathroom and lock the door." The man was getting closer. He'd reached our lawn now, about 20 feet from the porch. I could see him more clearly, and what I saw made my stomach drop. His eyes were wide, unfocused, his movements almost predatory. He was muttering something I couldn't hear. "I'm going back inside," I told the dispatcher, retreating through the door and locking it behind me. I moved to the kitchen window where I could still see him approaching. "Where are the police?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. "They should be there very soon," she said. "Stay on the line with me." The man reached our porch steps. Under the porch light, I could see blood on his face from a cut on his forehead. His clothes were disheveled, his eyes bloodshot and wild. He started climbing the steps. "He's coming up to my door," I said, panic rising in my voice. "What do I do?" "Do not engage with him," the dispatcher said firmly. "Stay inside with your doors locked. Officers are almost there." I backed away from the window, grabbed a kitchen knife, and stood in front of the hallway that led to the bathroom where Lisa and Emma were hiding. I could hear Emma crying softly. The man reached our back door and tried the handle, finding it locked. Then he started pounding on it, not knocking like a normal person asking for help, but pounding with both fists, erratically. I heard him shouting something slurred and incoherent. Just as I was wondering if the door would hold, I heard the blessed sound of sirens approaching. The man at our door heard them too. He stopped pounding and stood there swaying for a moment, then turned and started to stumble back toward his car. The police arrived seconds later, 2 cruisers pulling up to the intersection behind our house, their lights painting everything in surreal flashes of red and blue. I watched from the window as 3 officers approached the man, who was now halfway back to his wrecked car. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I saw them trying to talk to him. He wasn't cooperative. He kept gesturing wildly, trying to walk away from them. When one officer put a hand on his arm, the man took a swing at him. Within seconds, they had him on the ground and in handcuffs. One officer came to our door while the others dealt with the man. I let him in and tried to explain what had happened, though I was still shaking so badly I could barely form sentences. Lisa and Emma came out of the bathroom, Emma still crying quietly. "Is everyone okay in here?" the officer asked, looking at my wife and daughter with concern. We nodded, and I managed to say, "We were all inside when it happened." The officer, whose name tag read Martinez, took some information from us and then said, "I need to go help my partners, but more units are coming. We'll need statements from all of you." Before he left, I asked, "Was he drunk?" Officer Martinez's face hardened. "Looks like he's on something stronger than alcohol. We'll know more after he's been tested." He went back outside, and the 3 of us huddled together at the window, watching as more police cars arrived, along with an ambulance. The man was loaded into a police car, still struggling against the officers. Another officer approached our house about 20 minutes later. This one introduced himself as Sergeant Wilson. He was older, with a calm demeanor that helped settle my still racing heart. "We're going to need to keep your backyard as a scene for a while," he explained. "The driver appears to be heavily intoxicated, possibly on methamphetamine based on his behavior. We've conducted a search of his vehicle as part of our investigation. He hesitated, looking at Emma, then at us. "Mr. and Mrs. Anderson, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Lisa took Emma to the living room while Sergeant Wilson and I stood in the kitchen. "Sir, I thought you should know," he said in a lowered voice. "We found a loaded handgun in the driver's vehicle, 9mm, tucked under the passenger seat." My blood ran cold. "A gun." He nodded gravely. "Given his state and behavior, I'm very glad your family was safely inside when this occurred." It wasn't until that moment that the full reality hit me. I looked out at the backyard, at the crumpled car sitting exactly where our tent had been set up just hours earlier. Exactly where we would have been sleeping if Emma hadn't gotten sick. "Oh my God," I whispered. "We were supposed to be camping out there tonight. Our tent was set up right there." I pointed to the spot where the car now sat. "My daughter got sick, so we came inside instead." Sergeant Wilson's expression changed as he processed this information. He put a hand on my shoulder. "Sir, I don't want to alarm you further, but based on the skid marks at the intersection, we estimate he was doing close to 90 miles per hour when he missed the turn and came through your fence." 90 miles per hour, directly into our sleeping tent, and a loaded gun within reach of a man high out of his mind. I had to sit down. My legs simply wouldn't hold me anymore. The police were at our house until nearly dawn, taking statements, photographing everything, eventually towing away the car. Emma finally fell asleep on the couch around 4 in the morning. Lisa and I just sat there, holding hands, unable to speak. I keep thinking about it, how Emma's mysterious illness saved our lives, how we would have been directly in the path of that car, asleep and completely vulnerable. How even if we'd somehow survived the impact, we would have been at the mercy of a man so intoxicated he could barely stand, with access to a loaded weapon. It's been 4 months, and I still haven't slept a full night through. Whenever I close my eyes, I see that car hurtling toward our tent at 90 miles an hour. I see that man's wild eyes as he pounded on our door. The fence is fixed now. The grass has grown back over the tire tracks. But every time I look out there, I think about how close we came to not being here anymore. All 3 of us, just gone, because of one driver's choices and one intersection. Emma never got sick again that night after the initial vomiting. The doctor said it was probably just a passing stomach bug, but I'll never see it that way. Whatever made her sick that night saved our lives. I'm sure of it. Story 3. I still can't sleep properly after what happened 3 nights ago. I've been trying to make sense of it, but I can't. I need to get this off my chest, even if nobody believes me. I was back in my hometown in northeastern Argentina for my cousin's wedding. I've been living in Buenos Aires for the past 8 years, so coming back to this small coastal town always brings back memories. That night I couldn't sleep. Jet lag maybe, or just the weirdness of sleeping in my old childhood bedroom at my parents' house. Around midnight, I decided to go for a walk. The neighborhood was exactly how I remembered it. The same cracked sidewalks, the same rusty streetlights casting orange halos. It was a warm night, and I found myself following the old routes I used to take as a teenager. I was just enjoying the nostalgia, you know. Nothing weird about taking a midnight stroll in the place you grew up. I headed toward the coast, where you can hear the waves crashing in the distance. Most of the houses were dark, with just a few windows still lit up. The streets were empty except for the occasional stray cat. I was walking past the old corner store, now closed down and boarded up, when I first noticed her. She was standing under a streetlight about 50 meters ahead of me. At first, I didn't think much of it, just another person out late. But as I got closer, something felt off. She was wearing this deep blue dress that seemed to absorb the streetlight rather than reflect it. It was an unusual color, not quite navy, almost luminescent despite being dark. Her hair was long and black, falling past her shoulders in a way that looked too perfect, like it wasn't moving with the coastal breeze. I was planning to just nod politely and walk past her, the way you do with strangers at midnight when there's nobody else around. But she stepped directly into my path with this weird, fluid movement. It happened so fast. 1 second she was under the streetlight, and the next she was right in front of me. I almost bumped into her. "Do you believe in respect?" she asked. Her voice had this strange accent I couldn't place, not Argentinian, not anything I recognized. The question itself was bizarre enough, but the way she asked it made my skin crawl. Her eyes were fixed on mine, unblinking. Sure. Yes, I said, trying to be polite while also looking for a way around her. That's when I noticed she was holding a cloth bag that seemed to be filled with fruit. I could see the round shapes pressing against the fabric, and there was a sweet smell coming from it. Too sweet, like fruit that's just starting to rot. "Could you help me carry this? I'm going to the old station," she said. It wasn't really a question. Before I could respond, she was holding the bag out to me. Now, I'm not usually the type to follow strangers in the middle of the night, but something about her made me take the bag. I can't explain it. It was like I was watching myself from outside my body, making decisions I wouldn't normally make. The bag was heavier than it looked, and the fruit inside shifted in a way that felt wrong somehow, like the weight kept changing as we walked. We headed toward the coast, following the road that leads to the abandoned train station. It's been out of service for about 20 years now, just a crumbling building that teenagers use to drink or make out. As we walked, I tried to make conversation, asked her name, where she was from, but she only responded with these cryptic statements about the town, mentioning landmarks that haven't existed since I was a kid. "The bakery with the green shutters makes the best bread," she said at one point. "That bakery burned down when I was 12. I didn't tell her that." About halfway to the station, we passed the small park near the beach. There was a man there, muscular guy in a tank top, holding a sleeping toddler against his chest. He had a big dog with him, some kind of shepherd mix, on a leash. The dog was the first to notice us. It stopped dead in its tracks and stared at the woman in the blue dress, its body going completely rigid. Then it started making this noise, not barking, not growling, but this high-pitched whine that made the hair on my arms stand up. The dog began frantically sniffing the air, pulling against its leash, trying to both approach and back away from us at the same time. The man looked nervous. He kept glancing between his dog and the woman, clutching his child tighter. When we got closer, I nodded at him, that universal guy acknowledgement, but he didn't respond. His eyes were wide, darting from me to the woman and back again. The woman in the blue dress suddenly stopped and bent down as if to touch the dog. The animal recoiled so violently it nearly pulled the leash out of the man's hand. In that moment, the man made eye contact with me, and I swear to God, he looked terrified. Without saying a word, he picked up his pace and hurried away, practically jogging with the child in his arms and the dog scrambling alongside him. "Animals sense things humans cannot," the woman said after they left. She didn't seem bothered by the encounter at all. Her tone was casual, almost amused. We continued walking, now heading toward what locals call the railway neighborhood, a rougher area where houses were built too close to the old tracks. Nobody with money lives there. As a kid, my parents always told me to avoid it after dark. The streets got narrower here, the houses more dilapidated. There were fewer streetlights, making the shadows deeper. I was beginning to feel really uneasy. Why was I helping this stranger carry fruit to an abandoned train station in the middle of the night? I started thinking of an excuse to leave, to hand back her bag and return to my parents' house. That's when she leaned closer to me, too close, her face inches from mine, and whispered, "You should be wary of me, Martin Acosta." I froze. I hadn't told her my name. "I am what your grandmother would have called Baba Yaga," she continued, her breath cool against my ear. "I have known you for a very long time. My grandmother was Russian. She moved to Argentina after World War II and brought her superstitions with her. Baba Yaga was one of the stories she used to scare us kids, a witch who lived in the forest and ate children. I hadn't thought about those stories in years. "I think I should go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I handed her back the bag. "It's getting late, and my parents will worry." She took the bag without touching my hand somehow. Her lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Your parents are sleeping soundly, Martin. They won't miss you." That's when I knew I needed to get the hell out of there. I started backing away, trying to be casual about it. "Well, the station is just down that road," I said, pointing. "You can't miss it." She didn't look where I was pointing. She just kept staring at me with this strange, glazed look in her eyes. "Be careful on your way home," she said. "The streets remember you, even if you don't remember them." I turned and walked away as calmly as I could manage. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but something told me that would be a mistake. After about 20 meters, I couldn't help myself. I glanced back. She was standing exactly where I'd left her, completely motionless, still watching me. Even from that distance, I could see her smile had widened into something that wasn't quite human. The bag of fruit was gone. I don't know where it went or if it had ever really been there. I walked faster after that, not looking back again until I had turned the corner. When I finally reached my parents' house, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. Inside, everything was quiet. My parents were indeed asleep, just as she'd said they would be. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been some weird encounter with a mentally ill person. Or maybe I'd been more tired than I realized and had imagined the stranger parts. But then my mother mentioned over breakfast that my grandmother's old necklace, a silver Orthodox cross that had been sitting in her jewelry box for years, had somehow ended up on the kitchen table overnight. "Did you take it out, Martin?" she asked. I hadn't. Neither had she or my father. I went back to that neighborhood during daylight. I even walked all the way to the abandoned train station. There was no sign of the woman in the blue dress. But when I passed the spot where we'd met the man with the dog, I noticed something on the ground. A piece of fruit, some kind of plum or dark cherry, crushed into the pavement. It was covered in ants, but they were all dead, their tiny bodies frozen in place around the fruit's pulp. I'm back in Buenos Aires now, but I can't shake the feeling that something followed me home. Last night, I woke up at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning to find my apartment door wide open, even though I distinctly remember locking it before going to bed. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see her face, that not quite human smile, those unblinking eyes. I don't know what I encountered that night. I don't know if it was really Baba Yaga or just someone who knew enough about my family to frighten me. But I can't stop thinking about what she said, that she had known me for a long time. When I look back on my childhood memories, I keep thinking I can see her now, a blue-dressed figure in the background of moments I thought I was alone. I'm writing this because I need someone to tell me I'm not crazy, that there's a rational explanation. But deep down, I know there isn't. Whoever that woman was, she wasn't normal. And I'm terrified that our encounter wasn't random at all, but something she had been planning for a very long time. Story 4. It's been almost 4 years, but I can't stop thinking about what happened that night. Every time I hear a taxi slow down on my street, my heart still races. I know I should have reported it, but who would believe me? Nothing technically happened, but I know in my gut what almost did. I was 27 and working as a bartender at the Rusty Nail in Grayston. It wasn't a fancy place, but the tips were decent, and it helped pay my bills while I was building my graphic design portfolio. The hours were brutal, though. Most nights I wouldn't finish until 3 in the morning after cleaning up and cashing out. The bar was about a 20-minute walk from my apartment, which wasn't bad most nights. There were 2 ways to get home: along Main Street, where all the clubs and late-night spots were, or through what we called the Cut, a quieter route through some residential areas and past a small park. Main Street was always full of drunk people spilling out of clubs, trying to find rides, sometimes getting into fights. The Cut was darker and quieter, but it was usually just people walking their dogs or heading home from late shifts like me. That night, it was a Thursday in October, had been particularly exhausting. We'd had a private party that ran late, and I spent an hour cleaning up their mess. My feet were killing me, and I had a headache from the noise. It was chillier than I expected when I finally left, and I just wanted to get home without dealing with the rowdy Main Street crowd. Even though something in my gut told me to stick to the busy route that night, I ignored it. I was just too tired to deal with drunk guys hitting on me or having to sidestep people puking on the sidewalk. So I took the Cut. At first it was fine, just quiet, dark streets with houses where everyone was asleep. I had my phone in my hand, not even looking at it, just holding it like some kind of security blanket. I was about halfway home when I saw them. 4 guys, probably in their 30s, stumbling along the sidewalk ahead of me. I could tell from their loud voices and the way they were walking that they were drunk. I thought about crossing the street, but before I could, they noticed me. "Hey, where you going, sweetheart?" one of them called out. He was wearing a baseball cap and had a beard. The others turned around, and suddenly they were spreading out across the sidewalk, forming a kind of barrier. My stomach dropped. I tightened my grip on my phone and kept walking, hoping they'd just let me pass. But as I got closer, they didn't move. "I asked you a question," the same guy said, his voice harder now. "Where you going so late? Party's just getting started." "I'm heading home," I said firmly, trying to sound confident even though my heart was racing. "My boyfriend's waiting for me." A lie, but a necessary one. One of the other guys, shorter with a shaved head, moved closer. "We're just being friendly. Why don't you hang out with us for a bit?" I could smell the alcohol on his breath. "No thanks, I need to get home." I tried to step around them, but they shifted to block me. "Come on, don't be like that," Baseball Cap said, reaching toward my arm. I jerked back. "Don't touch me, I'm not interested, and I need to go home." Something in my tone must have gotten through to them. Or maybe it was the fact that I was clearly ready to start screaming, because after an uncomfortable few seconds of silence, the bald guy shrugged. "Whatever, bitch. We were just being nice." They finally moved aside, making exaggerated bowing gestures like they were doing me some huge favor. I walked past them as quickly as I could without running, feeling their eyes on my back. I heard them laughing and making crude comments as I put distance between us. My hands were shaking. I was furious and scared and so angry at myself for taking the cut instead of Main Street. I kept looking over my shoulder to make sure they weren't following me. They weren't, but the encounter had left me completely rattled. That's when the taxi pulled up. It was an older model sedan with a taxi sign on top. Nothing unusual for our town. The driver rolled down his window. He was an older man, maybe in his 50s, with gray hair and glasses. "You all right, miss? I saw those guys bothering you back there." I hesitated. I hadn't noticed any taxi driving by during that confrontation. "I'm fine," I said, still walking. He drove slowly alongside me. "It's late to be walking alone. I can give you a ride home, no charge. Just want to make sure you get there safely." Every instinct I had was screaming not to get in that car, but I was still shaken from the encounter with those men, and the thought of walking the rest of the way home alone suddenly seemed worse. Plus, he seemed normal enough, just an older guy trying to be nice. What were the chances I'd run into two dangerous situations in one night? "It's not far," I said, still hesitant. "All the more reason to let me drive you. No meter, I promise. Just being a good Samaritan." I made the worst decision of my life. I got in. At first, everything seemed fine. The car was clean and he was polite as I gave him my address. He introduced himself as Ray and asked about my job. Normal small talk. We headed in the right direction and I started to relax a little. "Those guys back there, they shouldn't be harassing women like that," he said, shaking his head. "No respect these days." "Yeah, it was scary," I admitted. "Thanks for stopping." We were getting close to my neighborhood when he missed the turn. "Oh, you needed to turn there," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Sorry about that. I'll take the next one." But he didn't. He kept driving, and we were heading away from the residential area toward the old industrial zone. My stomach tightened. "Actually, this isn't the right way," I said more firmly. "My apartment is back that way." "Just need to find a place to turn around," he said, but he kept driving deeper into the industrial area. The buildings around us were mostly abandoned warehouses and old factories. No one would be around at this hour, no witnesses. The realization of what was happening hit me like a punch to the gut. "Could you please turn around now?" I tried to sound calm, but my voice was shaking. "I really need to get home." He didn't answer, just kept driving until we reached a dead end by an old paper mill that had closed years ago. No streetlights, no houses, nothing but darkness and empty buildings. He stopped the car. For a moment, neither of us spoke. My hand was on the door handle, but I knew that if I ran, there was nowhere to go. No one to hear me scream. He turned to look at me, and his expression had completely changed. The friendly smile was gone. His eyes were cold and calculating as they moved over my face, down to my neck, my chest. "You know," he said, quietly, "you really shouldn't get into cars with strangers." Time seemed to stop. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was stare back at him, my entire body frozen in terror. Something changed in that moment. I don't know if it was my expression or what, but as he looked at me, his face shifted again. There was this flicker of, I don't know, hesitation, recognition. Whatever it was, it made him pause. And then he said something I'll never forget. "You're right." Just those two words. He said them in this strange, defeated tone, like he was answering a question I hadn't asked. Then he put the car back in drive and turned around. We drove back in complete silence. My hand never left the door handle. My phone was in my other hand. though I don't know what good it would have done. We didn't have service in that area. When we got close to my apartment complex, I told him to stop a block away. No way was I letting him know exactly where I lived. "This is fine," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He stopped the car. I expected him to say something, to grab me as I tried to leave, but he just stared straight ahead. I opened the door and practically fell out in my hurry to escape. I slammed it shut and ran all the way to my building without looking back once. Once inside my apartment, I locked the door, the deadbolt, and shoved a chair under the knob. I checked every window, every closet. I sat on my bathroom floor crying for hours, unable to process what had just happened, or almost happened. I never reported it. What would I say? A taxi driver gave me a free ride home and took a detour. He didn't hurt me. He didn't even threaten me explicitly. But I absolutely know what his intentions were when he drove me to that deserted area. The thing that haunts me most is why he changed his mind. What did he see in my face? Why did he say, "You're right," when I hadn't spoken? I've replayed that moment in my head 1,000 times and still can't make sense of it. For months afterward, I would take Ubers to work and back, even though I could barely afford it. I changed my walking routes. I bought pepper spray and a personal alarm. I became the person who texted friends when I got home safely. It's been almost 4 years, and I've mostly moved on. I don't tend bar anymore. Finally got a job in graphic design. I moved to a different apartment in a busier area, but sometimes when I'm walking alone at night and hear a car slow down behind me, I'm right back in that taxi, staring into the eyes of a man who, for some inexplicable reason, decided not to hurt me. I still don't know why he let me go. Maybe he saw something in my expression that made me human to him in a way his other victims weren't. Maybe he had a daughter my age, or maybe something scared him off. I'll never know. All I know is that I was supposed to disappear that night, and somehow I didn't. Story 5. It's been almost 6 months since it happened, and I've only now found the courage to write it down. My hands still shake when I think about it. I've always prided myself on being a man of reason and logic. How could I not as a minister of God's word? I'm supposed to guide others through their fears and superstitions, not succumb to them myself. I've spent 20 years dismissing ghost stories as nonsense. Whenever parishioners would come to me with tales of spirits or apparitions, I would gently explain how the mind plays tricks, especially in the dark or when grief-stricken. I had rational explanations for everything, until that evening last autumn. It was early October when I was visiting friends in the Welsh countryside near Sanghadir. We had enjoyed a pleasant afternoon of tea and theological discussion at the home of Mr. Williams, a fellow minister. The conversation had been stimulating, touching on matters of faith and scripture, and I remember feeling intellectually satisfied as I left their home around 5:30 in the evening. The sun was setting as I began my solitary walk back to my lodgings. The air had that particular autumn crispness that makes your lungs feel clean, and the trees along the canal were showing their first hints of gold and amber. I had decided to take the scenic route along the canal, as the weather was still fair despite the approaching dusk. I was perhaps a quarter mile from the Williams home when I first noticed the figure. It was standing near the edge of the canal path, partially obscured by the gathering shadows. At first glance, I took it for an elderly beggar. The countryside has its share of wandering souls seeking charity, and I instinctively reached for the few coins in my pocket, thinking I might offer the poor soul something for supper. As I drew nearer, something about the figure's stillness made me uneasy. Most beggars approach when they see a potential benefactor, but this one remained motionless, as if waiting for me specifically. "Good evening," I called out, still about 20 paces away. There was no response, no movement whatsoever. I slowed my approach, squinting through the fading light. The figure was roughly man-sized, but something was wrong with its proportions. Its head seemed too large for its body, and there was something about its posture that struck me as unnatural. That's when it turned to face me fully, and God help me, I will never forget what I saw. The face, if you can call it that, was like nothing I had ever seen on this earth. It had the appearance of a corpse that had been drained of all blood and life, with skin pulled taut across a skull-like structure. The color was an unnatural pale gray, not the pallor of death, but something else entirely, like ash or old parchment. Deep furrows creased its forehead, giving it an expression of perpetual anguish. Its mouth hung half open, revealing nothing inside. No teeth, no tongue, just emptiness. But what struck me most, profoundly, were the eyes. They were sunken deep into the skull, yet they shone with an intelligence that was undeniably present and aware. Those eyes fixed on me with a terrible recognition, as though it had been waiting for me specifically. Most disturbing of all was its head, which was partially wrapped in bands of yellowed cloth, like the bindings of a poorly mummified corpse. These strips hung loose in places, revealing patches of that terrible gray skin beneath. I stood frozen, unable to move or speak, my throat constricted, and my breath came in shallow gasps. Every rational thought fled my mind, replaced by a primal terror I had never experienced before. This was no trick of the light, no misidentified natural object. What stood before me was something that should not, could not exist. For what felt like an eternity, we simply stared at one another, the thing and I. Then, mercifully, my paralysis broke. I turned and ran as fast as my legs would carry me down the canal path. My heart pounded violently in my chest, and I could hear nothing but the rush of blood in my ears. I ran without looking back until I had covered perhaps 60 yards. Only then did I stop, bent double and gasping for breath. A terrible compulsion seized me. I had to know if it was following me. I turned back, half expecting to see nothing, to confirm that it had been a momentary hallucination brought on by the poor light. But it was still there, in the exact same spot, watching me. Something bizarre happened then. A kind of madness took hold of me. Instead of continuing to flee, I felt a sudden indignation, an anger that overrode my fear. Who or what was this thing to terrorize me? I was a man of God, a respected reverend. I had my umbrella with me, a sturdy thing with a heavy wooden handle, and in a moment of either courage or insanity, I raised it like a weapon and walked back toward the apparition. "What are you?" I called out, my voice cracking despite my attempt at authority. "Identify yourself in the name of God." The figure remained motionless as I approached. When I was within striking distance, I swung my umbrella forcefully, expecting to connect with solid flesh. The umbrella passed through the entity as if it were nothing but smoke. I stumbled forward with the momentum of my swing, nearly falling. When I regained my balance and looked up, I saw that while the head remained solid, that terrible cloth-wrapped skull, below the neck, there was no body at all. There was only a column of what looked like churning darkness, like smoke or mist, but with purpose and form. It hovered perhaps an inch above the ground. A sound escaped my lips then, not a scream, but a whimper of pure terror. Whatever rational explanations I had been clinging to evaporated in that moment. This was no human, no creature of flesh and blood. It was something else entirely. I backed away, unable to take my eyes off it. Then I turned and fled again, running faster than I thought possible for a man of my age and profession. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I didn't slow until I had put considerable distance between myself and that thing. Yet even in my terror, I felt a strange and terrible curiosity. It was as though the apparition had cast some spell over me, drawing me back. After running perhaps 200 yards, I stopped once more and looked back, half expecting it to have vanished. Instead, I saw it moving. It didn't walk as a man walks. It glided just above the surface of the path, the misty column beneath the head propelling it forward with a terrible grace. It was following me, but slowly, deliberately, as if it had all the time in the world. I should have run again. Any sane man would have. But I found myself rooted to the spot, watching its approach with a mixture of horror and fascination. It moved past me, not toward me, continuing down the path in the direction I had been heading. Without conscious thought, I found myself following it. We proceeded this way for perhaps a quarter mile, the apparition gliding ahead, me following at a safe distance. We passed the canal locks and approached the old stone churchyard wall that bordered the path. When it reached the wall, the apparition did not stop. It passed through the solid stone as if it weren't there, emerging on the other side in the churchyard. I watched from the path as it moved between ancient gravestones toward a massive old yew tree that stood in the center of the burial ground. Upon reaching the tree, the apparition seemed to pause. The head turned toward me one final time, those terrible intelligent eyes finding mine even across that distance. Then, like smoke dispersed by a sudden breeze, it simply dissolved into nothing. One moment it was there, the next, gone. I remember nothing after that. According to what I was later told, a local farmer found me unconscious on the path outside the churchyard wall around 8 o'clock that evening. I had apparently collapsed where I stood. The man recognized me as a visiting minister and brought me to his home, where I remained unconscious for nearly 2 hours. When I finally awoke, I was in a state of confusion and terror. The farmer and his wife thought I had been attacked by robbers, but I could not bring myself to tell them what I had actually seen. Who would believe such a tale? I certainly wouldn't have just one day prior. The experience left me physically and mentally shattered. I developed a fever that night and remained bedridden at my lodgings for a full week afterward, suffering from what the local doctor diagnosed as nervous exhaustion. I couldn't sleep without seeing those terrible eyes, and even the smallest shadow would send me into a state of panic. It was only after I had somewhat recovered that I finally confided in my host, Mr. Jenkins. I expected disbelief or concern for my mental state. Instead, his face grew pale as I described the apparition, particularly the yellowed bindings around its head. When I finished my account, he sat in silence for a long moment before speaking. 15 years ago, he said slowly, there was a man who lived in the ruins of an old cottage near that yew tree. He was a recluse, a strange fellow who kept to himself. He had some sort of skin condition that he was very sensitive about, and he took to wrapping his head in strips of yellow calico to hide it. My blood ran cold as he continued. One winter, people noticed they hadn't seen him for some time. When the authorities finally checked his cottage, it was abandoned. There were signs of a hasty departure, but the man himself was never found. No body was ever discovered, though many assumed he had died somewhere in the woods or perhaps fallen into the canal. I have tried since that night to rationalize what I saw. Perhaps I had heard this story before, forgotten it consciously, but retained it in my subconscious mind. Perhaps the stress of my work, combined with the fading light, created a vivid hallucination that my mind then connected to this forgotten tale. But I know what I saw, those eyes, that terrible intelligence. It was no product of my imagination. And the way my umbrella passed through it, as if striking at empty air. I have not returned to Sangadir since that night, nor do I ever intend to. My faith remains strong, but my understanding of this world and what may exist beyond it has been forever altered. I find myself unable to dismiss the ghost stories of my parishioners as I once did. When they speak of encounters with the unexplained, I listen with a new sympathy and understanding. I write this account not to convince others or to seek explanations, but simply to unburden my soul of this terrible memory. Perhaps by setting it down in words, I can finally begin to free myself from those terrible eyes that still watch me in my dreams. But I know with certainty that whatever I encountered by the canal that autumn evening was not of this world, and I fear that somewhere, near an ancient yew tree in a Welsh churchyard, it waits still. Story 6. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened last summer. My buddy Greg and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We both needed a break from our jobs and wanted to get away from everything for a few days. Nothing extreme, just someplace quiet where we could fish, hike, and not see another human being for a while. We found this spot about 3 hours from town, up in the national forest. It wasn't on any of the popular camping apps, just a little notation on an old Forest Service map Greg had. The ranger we called beforehand said it was technically still maintained, but very low priority, basically meaning they might swing by once a season to make sure it hadn't burned down. Perfect. That's exactly what we wanted. The drive there was rough as hell. The last 7 miles were on this old logging road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. My Jeep was scraping bottom on rocks, and at one point we had to get out and move a fallen branch. But that's what made it special, right? The harder it is to get somewhere, the fewer people you'll run into. We finally pulled into the campground around 3 in the afternoon. And I use that term loosely. It was just a small clearing with a couple of fire rings, some ancient-looking picnic tables with the wood all gray and splintered, and 2 outhouses down a little path. The whole place had this abandoned feel to it, like we were the first people to visit in years. While I started unpacking the Jeep and setting up our tent, Greg wandered off to check out the area. I didn't think much of it until I noticed him standing by the outhouses at the bottom of a slight hill, maybe 40 yards from our campsite. He was just standing there, staring at one of them with the door open. Then he checked the second one before walking back up to camp. His face looked weird when he returned. Not scared exactly, but confused, like when you see something your brain can't quite process. "Hey, Mason," he said, his voice oddly flat. "You should go check out the first outhouse." I figured he'd found something gross. Maybe some animal had died in there, or someone had left an absolute disaster. Wouldn't be the first time I'd seen a campground toilet turned into a nightmare. "I'm kind of busy setting up the tent here," I told him. "How bad is it?" "It's not what you think," he said, shaking his head. "Just go look. It's not gross or anything, just weird." Something in his tone made me curious enough to drop what I was doing. I walked down the little dirt path to the outhouses. They were the typical Forest Service design. Weathered wooden structures with metal roofs and those half-moon cutouts on the doors. The one on the left had a men's symbol carved into it, barely visible under years of fading. That's the one Greg had been most interested in. I pulled open the door, expecting, well, I don't know what I was expecting, but it definitely wasn't what I found. Inside, taking up most of the small space in front of the toilet, were 3 large backpacks. Not cheap day packs, but serious expedition-grade backpacks. The kind that cost hundreds of dollars and are designed for week-long treks. They were just sitting there, in an outhouse, in the middle of nowhere. I remember standing there for what felt like minutes, just staring at them. They were arranged almost carefully, like someone had deliberately placed them there. Not thrown or abandoned, but positioned. The outhouse didn't smell that bad, just the usual outhouse smell, so they couldn't have been there too long. My first thought was that maybe some hikers had stashed their gear temporarily while they explored nearby. But there was no trail here, just the old logging road we'd driven in on. And who leaves expensive gear in an outhouse? I bent down and looked at the packs more closely. They were dusty but not deteriorated. Definitely hadn't been there all winter. The first one was a dark green Osprey, probably 70 liters. The second was a red Gregory that looked almost new. The third was a black pack with blue trim that I didn't recognize the brand of, but it was just as high-end as the others. Something felt deeply wrong about finding them there. I hesitated, then decided to unzip the first one, the green Osprey. Inside was exactly what you'd expect from a serious backpacker. A compact sleeping bag, cooking gear, clothes in Ziploc bags, a small camp stove, some freeze-dried meals. Everything was neatly packed and organized. This wasn't some abandoned junk. This was someone's carefully prepared camping gear. The second pack contained similar items, another sleeping bag, more clothes, a first aid kit, some trail guides for the region. Nothing unusual, except for the fact that it was sitting in an outhouse in the middle of nowhere. When I opened the third pack, that's when things went from strange to genuinely disturbing. The entire pack, and I mean the entire pack, was stuffed full of Skittles candy. Not just a few bags, but dozens and dozens of packages. Regular bags, king-size packs, those giant resealable pouches. There were even foreign-looking packages with flavors I'd never seen before. The whole 80-liter backpack contained nothing but Skittles. No clothes, no gear, no camping equipment, just candy, packed in so tightly that when I unzipped it, a few bags actually popped out from the pressure. I zipped everything back up exactly as I'd found it and walked back up to the campsite. Greg was waiting for me, sitting on a log with a strange expression. "Well?" he asked. "What the actual fuck?" was all I could say. We spent the next hour theorizing. Maybe it was some kind of drop for drug smugglers. But why use expensive backpacks? And why Skittles? Was it some weird prank? A geocache gone wrong? None of our explanations made any sense. What made it even weirder was how isolated we were. We hadn't passed another vehicle on the logging road. There were no footprints around the outhouses except ours. No sounds of people nearby. Nothing. We decided to leave everything exactly as we found it. If someone came back for their gear, we didn't want them to know we'd been through it. And if it was something sketchy, we definitely didn't want to be involved. That night, every sound in the forest made us jump. I kept imagining someone walking into our camp looking for their backpacks, or worse, looking for their Skittles. We took turns staying awake, watching the campfire burn down to embers, neither of us willing to admit how unsettled we felt. The second day, we explored the area a bit, always staying within sight of camp. We found no evidence of other visitors, no footprints, no candy wrappers, nothing. The packs remained in the outhouse, undisturbed. By the third day, the initial shock had worn off a bit, but the packs were still there. We checked them again, half expecting them to have disappeared overnight, but they sat in exactly the same position. The whole situation felt increasingly surreal. We stayed 4 nights total, and during that entire time, we never saw or heard another human being. No vehicles came down the logging road. No hikers passed through. The backpacks remained in the outhouse the whole time. A bizarre mystery sitting just 40 yards from where we slept. The weirdest part was how the whole experience changed the feel of our trip. What should have been a peaceful getaway became something tense and watchful. We found ourselves speaking in hushed tones as if someone might be listening. We kept looking over our shoulders while fishing in the nearby stream. The isolation that had initially attracted us now felt oppressive, like we were being watched by the forest itself. When we packed up to leave on the 5th day, we had one final debate about what to do with the packs. Taking them felt wrong. They weren't ours, and despite the strangeness, someone might come back for them. Leaving them felt equally wrong. What if something sinister was going on? We finally decided to report what we'd found to the conservation officers once we got back to civilization. Maybe they'd have some explanation, or maybe they'd investigate. The officer we spoke to took notes about the location and descriptions of the bags. He didn't seem particularly alarmed, just mildly curious. "We'll send someone out to check it out," he assured us, but something in his tone suggested it wasn't a priority. I left my phone number, asking him to let me know what they found, but I never heard back. That was last summer, and I still think about those backpacks all the time. I've Googled missing hikers in the area, looked for news stories about anything strange in those woods, even searched for bulk Skittles thefts. Nothing connects. Sometimes I wonder if we should have taken the packs with us, or at least the Skittles bag, as proof of how bizarre it was. Other times, I'm glad we left them alone. Whatever was happening there, I'm not sure I want to know the full story. I've been camping my whole life and have seen some strange things in the backcountry, but nothing has ever left me feeling so deeply unsettled as those 3 backpacks. It's the randomness that gets me. The first 2 packs were so normal, so ordinary, making the third one all the more inexplicable. Who fills an expensive backpack with nothing but candy and leaves it in an outhouse in the middle of nowhere? And why? It's the kind of question that keeps me awake sometimes, staring at the ceiling, wondering if there was something bigger going on that we accidentally stumbled into. We never went back to that campsite. Greg and I still go camping, but we stick to more established areas now. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, I guess. But I'd be lying if I said I don't still wonder about those packs and whether they're still sitting there in that outhouse waiting for someone to claim them. Story 7. I still don't sleep well some nights. It's been 4 years since our hike in Redwood Forest, but I can't shake the feeling that we were being watched that day. My therapist says writing about it might help, so here goes. It was early spring, one of those perfect days where the air feels new. Dad had been planning this hike for weeks. He'd found some hidden gem trail system about 2 hours from our house. Mom packed a ridiculous amount of snacks as usual, and my little brothers, the twins, were bouncing off the walls at 7 a.m. when we piled into our old Subaru. My sister Jen was 16 then, and completely pissed about being forced to come along. I was 14 and still in that phase where I actually enjoyed family stuff, though I'd never admit it to Jen. She spent the entire car ride with her earbuds in, aggressively texting her friends about how her family was literally ruining her life by making her spend a Saturday in nature. We arrived around 9:30 in the morning. The parking lot was almost empty, just an old pickup truck and a forest ranger vehicle. Dad pointed this out as a good sign. See? No crowds. We'll have the trails to ourselves. If I could go back in time, I'd beg him to turn around right there. The main trail was wide and well maintained. Dad had a map and kept showing us where we were heading. The twins, Jake and Ben, ran ahead looking for lizards and cool sticks. Mom kept calling them back. Stay where I can see you. Normal stuff. Nothing felt off. We hiked for about an hour, stopping at viewpoints and taking family photos. Dad kept pointing out different trees and plants like he always did. The twins were collecting pine cones. Jen had finally put her phone away and was actually laughing at Dad's terrible jokes. Then Dad noticed a narrower trail branching off from the main one. Hey, look at this, he said, checking his map. This trail isn't marked clearly, but I think it loops back around to the main path. Should be a nice detour. Mom looked skeptical. Is it on the map at all? Sort of, Dad replied. It's dotted, so it might be seasonal, but it's clear enough and it'll only add about 40 minutes to our hike. I remember Jen rolling her eyes. Great, more walking. But the twins were excited about an adventure, so we all followed Dad onto the narrower trail. The difference was immediate. The main trail had been open, with sunlight filtering through the trees. This path was darker, the trees growing closer together, the undergrowth thicker. The air felt cooler too. I didn't think much of it at first. It was just a less used trail. But after about 20 minutes, I started noticing things. There were no boot prints in the dirt, no granola bar wrappers or water bottle caps like you usually find, even on remote trails. Nothing to suggest other people had been there recently. This is weird, Jen whispered to me. It's like nobody's been here in forever. Dad was still confidently leading us, though he was checking the map more frequently. The twins had stopped running ahead and were walking closer to Mom. The path got narrower, with branches reaching across it in places. We had to duck under some and push others aside. That's when Jake said, "What's that smell?" I'd been noticing it too, a sickly sweet smell mixed with something sharper. Mom told the twins it was probably just a dead animal somewhere off the trail. It happens in nature, she said, trying to sound casual. But I saw her glance at Dad with concern. We kept walking, but everyone was quieter now. Even the forest seemed quieter. Fewer bird calls, no rustling in the undergrowth. The smell got stronger. Then we came to a spot where the path dipped between two small rises. And that's where we found it. A deer lay on its side in the middle of the path. It was a doe, not particularly large. From a distance, it might have looked like it was sleeping. But as we got closer, we all stopped dead in our tracks. The deer was covered, and I mean covered, in X-shaped cuts, dozens of them. Each one was exactly the same size, maybe an inch across, carved with what must have been surgical precision. They ran along its sides, across its legs, even on its face and snout. The cuts weren't random. They were evenly spaced, like some kind of pattern. Mom immediately grabbed the twins and turned them away, but they'd already seen it. Ben started crying quietly. "What the hell?" Dad whispered, moving closer to examine it. "Don't touch it," Mom hissed. The deer hadn't been dead long. There was very little blood on the ground beneath it, which made no sense given the number of cuts. Its eyes were open, glassy, but the worst part was that there were no flies on it, no insects at all. Nothing natural would avoid fresh meat like that. Jen was taking pictures with her phone. Her hands were shaking. "Stop that," Mom said. "We need to go, now." Dad nodded, finally looking scared. This isn't normal predator behavior." No shit, Jen whispered. That's when I noticed something else. The ground around the deer was completely undisturbed. No drag marks, no footprints, nothing to suggest how the deer got there or who had cut it. Did someone put it here? I asked, immediately regretting saying it out loud. Dad looked at me, then scanned the trees around us. For the first time in my life, I saw genuine fear on his face. We're going back to the main trail, he said firmly. Stay together. No wandering off. We had to walk around the deer to continue on the path. None of us wanted to backtrack. It would have meant spending more time in those woods. Dad believed we were closer to the end of the loop than the beginning. As we passed the deer, I couldn't help but look at it again. The X marks were so perfect, so deliberate. And I swear, though I've never told anyone this part, I saw that one of the X marks on its flank wasn't there when we first stopped. It looked fresher than the others. The next 30 minutes were the longest of my life. We walked quickly, with Dad in front and Mom bringing up the rear, keeping the twins between them. Jen and I stayed in the middle. Nobody spoke. We all just listened. The forest felt different now. Before, it had just been quiet. Now it felt like it was holding its breath, watching us. I kept hearing slight movements in the trees, but whenever I looked, nothing was there. Then Ben whispered, "Someone's following us." Mom shushed him immediately, but we all heard it after that. Footsteps that weren't quite in sync with ours. They'd stop when we stopped, resume when we resumed. "It's just an echo," Dad said, but his voice cracked. We walked faster. The twins were practically jogging to keep up. I kept looking back, but the path curved so much I couldn't see far behind us. After what felt like forever, the path widened slightly, and we could see the main trail up ahead. Dad almost ran the last 100 feet. When we reached the junction, we all bunched together, looking back at the narrow path we'd just escaped. There was nothing there, just trees and undergrowth, but I know what I heard. We practically power-walked back to the parking lot. The pickup truck was gone. Just our car remained. Dad hustled us all inside, and we drove away much faster than he normally would on those winding roads. The drive home was almost completely silent. The twins fell asleep, exhausted from fear and adrenaline. Jen didn't put her earbuds back in. She just stared out the window. Mom kept looking in the rearview mirror, though I don't think she was checking on us. That night, nobody mentioned what we'd seen. It was like we all silently agreed not to talk about it. The twins had nightmares for weeks. I caught Jen researching animal mutilations online, but pretended not to notice. I did my own research later. There are cases of unexplained animal mutilations all over the country. Some blame cultists, others blame government experiments or aliens. Nothing I found explained those perfect X marks. Dad never took us back to that trail system. We still go hiking as a family sometimes, but always on popular busy trails. We stay closer together. Dad carries bear spray now, and a bigger knife. Mom always makes sure we have fully charged phones. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has found that deer or others like it. I wonder if whoever or whatever made those marks is still out there in those woods. I wonder if they watched us that day, following just out of sight, waiting for us to split up or fall behind. I've looked at Jen's photos of the deer many times, analyzing every detail. There's one thing I've never told my family. In the background of one photo, partially hidden behind a tree, there's what looks like a boot. Just the toe of it, barely visible. But it's there. We were not alone on that trail. And sometimes on quiet nights when I can't sleep, I swear I hear footsteps outside my window that stop when I listen for them. I don't know what was happening in those woods that day. but I know we were lucky to leave them. Story 8. I've never been a superstitious person. Growing up in Westbrook Estates, our gated community in South Florida was about as ordinary as it gets. Manicured lawns, community pool parties, and neighbors who smiled but mostly kept to themselves. My parents raised me with science and reason. Dad's an accountant, and Mom teaches biology at the local high school. But what happened 2 months ago has left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the world. I still haven't told my parents. I don't think they'd believe me, and honestly, I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I need to tell someone, and I guess anonymous strangers on the internet are as good as anyone. It started when my Uncle Mateo came to visit. He's my mom's older brother, and they're not exactly close. Mom left Cuba when she was 12, and she's embraced American life completely. Uncle Mateo stayed behind until his 20s and brought a lot of the old traditions with him when he finally came over. He's what they call a babalavo, a high-ranking priest in Santeria. Mom always rolls her eyes when anyone mentions this. Mateo and his superstitions, she'd say. Dad would just shrug and say, live and let live, but I could tell he thought it was all nonsense too. Uncle Mateo doesn't visit often, maybe once every few years. So when he showed up unannounced that Saturday morning in July, it was already unusual. What made it stranger was that he wasn't alone. 2 men were with him, both older, maybe in their 60s. One was tall and rail-thin with skin so dark it almost had a blue tint, and the other was heavy-set with a patchy beard. Neither spoke English, or at least they pretended not to when my parents tried to make conversation. The weirdest part? They had a goat, a live, actual goat, in the back of Uncle Mateo's old pickup truck, tied with rope, but otherwise just chilling there in the truck bed. Dad nearly had a fit. Mateo, what the hell? You can't bring livestock into Westbrook. The HOA will have a field day. Uncle Mateo just smiled that easy smile of his and put his hand on Dad's shoulder. Brother, it's only for a few hours. A small matter I need to take care of. You and Sarah go about your day. Pretend we're not even here. Mom looked concerned, but didn't protest. That's always been their dynamic. Uncle Mateo does whatever he wants, and Mom just sighs and lets it happen. They went inside to talk, while I hung back on the porch, watching the 2 strangers with the goat. The thin one caught me staring and winked. Something about his gaze made my skin crawl. My parents ended up leaving to run errands. I think Dad just wanted to be gone while whatever was happening, happened. I stayed home, supposedly doing summer reading for AP English, but really just playing Elden Ring in my room. Around 2 in the afternoon, I heard activity in the backyard. Our house backs up to a small wooded area that separates our neighborhood from the highway. It's not deep, maybe 50 yards of scrubby Florida pine and palmetto, but it gives us privacy. I went to my window, which overlooks the yard, and that's when I saw them. Uncle Mateo and his friends had the goat on a leash. They were digging a hole near our back fence, maybe 20 feet from the house. I should have gone downstairs to ask what they were doing, but something told me to just watch. The hole wasn't very big or deep, maybe 2 feet across and as deep as a man's forearm. When they finished digging, the thin man reached into a bag and pulled out what looked like a rock about the size of a softball. Even from my window, I could see it wasn't a normal rock. It had been carved to have some kind of face, not detailed, but definitely eyes, a nose, and what might have been a mouth. They placed this stone in the hole, and then, I swear I'm not making this up, Uncle Mateo pulled out a knife, a real knife with a curved blade that caught the sunlight. The heavy man held the goat still while Uncle Mateo said something, a prayer or chant I couldn't hear clearly. Then, in one quick motion, he slit the goat's throat. I almost yelled out, almost ran downstairs to stop them, but I was frozen. They positioned the dying animal so its blood poured directly onto the stone face in the hole. The goat kicked and struggled for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. I'd never seen anything die before. It was horrible, but I couldn't look away. When the goat finally went still, they wrapped its body in a tarp and put it in the truck. They didn't bury the stone, though. They just covered the hole with a piece of plywood and piled some branches on top. I ducked away from the window when Uncle Mateo looked up toward the house. 10 minutes later, I heard his truck start up and drive away. They left without saying goodbye. When my parents got home, I didn't tell them what I'd seen. I don't know why. Maybe I was protecting Uncle Mateo, or maybe I was scared they wouldn't believe me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that stone with the face, soaking in blood under a piece of plywood in our backyard. 2 weeks passed, nothing strange happened, and I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing, or at least exaggerated it in my mind. Then Uncle Mateo returned, this time alone and late in the evening. He spoke with my parents briefly at the door, then went straight to the backyard with a flashlight. I watched from my window again as he removed the plywood and dug up the stone. Even in the dim light, I could see it had changed. It was darker, almost black now, and seemed to gleam wetly, though it hadn't rained in days. Uncle Mateo wrapped it carefully in a red cloth, tucked it under his arm, and left without coming back inside. "What was that about?" I asked Mom when she came upstairs to say goodnight. She shrugged. "Your uncle needed to pick something up he'd left here. You know how he is." I almost told her then, but something stopped me. I think deep down, I didn't want to know what explanation she might give. Some things are better left unquestioned. Everything went back to normal for about a week. Then came the night I'll never forget. It was a Wednesday. I remember that clearly. August 3rd. I was up late. Summer vacation. No reason to keep a schedule. My parents had gone to bed around 10, and I was alone in my room, watching YouTube videos with headphones on. Around 1:30 in the morning, I opened my window a crack. It was one of those rare August nights in Florida where the humidity breaks and there's actually a nice breeze. I must have dozed off because I jolted awake sometime later. My laptop had gone to sleep, and the room was dark except for the faint glow of my digital clock, 3:17 a.m. Something felt wrong, really wrong. It took me a few seconds to realize what it was. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. If you've ever lived in Florida, you know that's not natural. There's always noise at night, crickets, frogs, rustling palmetto leaves, distant traffic. But now there was nothing. Even the air felt different, dense, like right before a thunderstorm, but without the electricity. Static, dead air. The breeze that had been coming through my cracked window had completely stopped. I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake, heart pounding. The silence was so absolute I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I told myself it was nothing, probably just a momentary lull, but I couldn't shake the feeling of wrongness. I looked toward my window, still cracked open about 3 inches. Moonlight spilled across my floor, bright, almost full moon that night. As I stared at the silver rectangle of light on my carpet, something changed. A shadow moved across it. Something was outside my window. I should have closed it immediately. I should have jumped out of bed and slammed it shut. But I didn't. Instead, like an idiot in a horror movie, I got up and moved toward it, curious despite my fear. When I was about 3 feet away, I saw them, fingers curling over the bottom edge of my window. Not human fingers. They were too long, too thin, jointed in places human fingers don't bend. Pitch black, like they were cut from the night sky itself, with blunt but pointed tips. They seemed to absorb the moonlight around them, creating tiny voids against the white paint of my window frame. I stopped breathing. The fingers, there were 4 of them, moved with terrible purpose, feeling along the frame like they were searching for a way to grip it better, to pull it open wider. They left no marks, made no sound as they slid along the wood and glass. I stood there, paralyzed. My brain kept trying to rationalize what I was seeing, a trick of the light, a tree branch, a bird. But I knew it was none of those things. The worst part was how methodical they were, how deliberately they explored the window's edge. This wasn't random. This was intelligent. Something was trying to get in, something that knew exactly what it was doing. I don't know how long I stood there watching. Seconds, minutes. Time seemed meaningless. Then, suddenly, as if sensing they were being observed, the fingers went still. A 5th one appeared, longer than the others, joining them on the windowsill, and then, slowly, a 6th. This one had an extra joint, or knuckle, or whatever you'd call it. It bent in a way that made my stomach turn. There was a pause, and I swear I felt something looking at me through that 3-inch gap, though I couldn't see anything but darkness beyond the glass. The fingers began to pull, not trying to be subtle anymore. The window shifted slightly in its frame, scraping quietly as it opened another 1/2 inch. That sound broke my paralysis. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet and falling hard on my ass. When I looked up, the fingers were gone, just gone, like they'd never been there. The silence remained, though, that unnatural, complete absence of sound. I crawled across my floor, staying low like somehow that would keep me safe, and reached up to slam my window shut. I locked it and pulled the blinds down so hard the cord snapped. I grabbed my phone, thinking I'd call someone. But who? What would I even say? Hey, some non-human fingers were trying to open my window. I sat on the floor with my back against my bed, staring at the window, waiting. Nothing happened. No more fingers. No sound. Just that oppressive silence that felt like it was filling my room, pressing against my eardrums. I must have sat there for hours, afraid to move, afraid to make a sound. At some point, I realized light was seeping around the edges of my blinds. Dawn was coming. Only then did I hear the first bird chirp, then another. The world was waking up, sounds returning like they'd never left. By the time my mom knocked on my door to ask why I was sitting on the floor, the morning was bright and normal. I made up some excuse about dropping my phone. She gave me a weird look, but didn't push it. I spent that day in a daze, jumping at shadows and staying away from windows. That night, I pushed my dresser in front of my window and slept with all the lights on. It's been 2 months now. Nothing like that has happened again, but I still can't shake the feeling that something found me that night. Something connected to that blood-soaked stone with the face. Something my uncle knows about. I haven't told anyone until now, and I probably won't tell anyone else. Who would believe me? Sometimes I don't even believe myself, but I know what I saw. I know those fingers weren't human. And I know, somehow, they were there because of what Uncle Mateo did in our backyard. He hasn't been back since, and my parents never mentioned the incident. I check my window locks obsessively now. I've started researching Santeria, trying to understand what ritual he might have been performing. but I'm afraid of what I might learn. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed again. All I know is that on quiet nights when the wind dies down, I feel like something's waiting just outside, those impossible fingers poised to try my window again. And one day, I'm afraid the lock won't be enough. Story 9. I can't stop thinking about what happened a few weeks ago. I haven't told many people because they'd probably think I'm crazy or making it up. But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has experienced something similar. I've lived in Pinewood all my life. Small town, about 3,000 people, surrounded by miles of forest. Most locals avoid going deep into the woods, especially at night. There are all these local legends about people getting lost or hearing strange noises, but I've always found peace there. For the past 5 years, I've been doing these night hikes. I know it sounds weird, but there's something calming about walking the trails when everyone else is asleep. I usually head out around midnight with just my headlamp and a thermos of coffee, then walk until sunrise. I know every trail like the back of my hand. 3 weeks ago, on October 2nd, I went for one of my regular hikes. The air felt heavy that night. Not quite cold, but with that damp smell that comes before autumn really kicks in. I remember checking the temperature before leaving, 53 degrees, perfect for hiking. I'd been walking for about an hour when I reached this fork in the trail I know really well. Normally, I always take the right path, which leads to this amazing overlook where you can see the whole valley. But that night, something just pulled me toward the left fork. I still can't explain why I went that way. I've passed that junction hundreds of times and never once taken the left trail. It goes down into this hollow where the trees grow super dense, and it always felt off to me. The left trail dips down pretty quickly, and the weird thing about that hollow is how sound just dies there. Like you can't even hear the highway that's only a couple miles away. As I was heading down, maybe 50 yards in, I noticed this weird flickering through the trees. At first, I thought it might be someone camping, which would be strange since nobody camps in these woods. I switched off my headlamp and crouched down, moving slowly toward the light. What I found still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. There was a fire burning in what looked like, I guess you'd call it a settlement, but not like any campsite I've ever seen. There were these structures, maybe 20 or 30 of them, scattered in a clearing about the size of a basketball court. They weren't tents. They were more like shelters cobbled together from whatever someone could find. Some were made from scrap wood nailed together, others from old metal signs bent and propped against trees. A few had broken tent poles holding up what looked like bed sheets or tarps. In the middle was this fire burning in what used to be a car tire. The fire wasn't huge, but it cast enough light that I could see the whole area had this orange glow to it. The creepiest part? There wasn't a single person there, not one. I stayed crouched at the edge for maybe 5 minutes, just watching, waiting for someone to appear. Nothing. The place felt paused, if that makes sense, like whoever lived there had just stepped away for a minute and would be right back. Something in my gut told me to leave, but my curiosity was stronger. I moved into the camp, keeping my headlamp off and stepping as quietly as possible. Some of the shelters were big enough that someone could crawl inside, while others were just lean-tos that would barely keep the rain off. The first shelter I looked into had a sleeping bag inside, half rolled like someone had just gotten up. Next to it was a plastic bag with some clothes inside and an empty water bottle. In another shelter, there was this old radio with a wire antenna stretched up through the roof. It wasn't on, but it looked like it had been used recently. no dust, batteries still in it. I found an open backpack in one of the bigger structures, with toiletries and a deck of playing cards spilled out. Everything looked used but not abandoned. Like these weren't things people would just leave behind. Walking further into the camp, I noticed more details that made my heart race. There was a pair of worn boots placed neatly outside one shelter, a jacket folded on a stump near another. I even found a faded photograph pinned to the inside wall of one shelter, a woman holding a baby. The photo was old and creased, like it had been carried in a wallet for years. The fire in the center was freshly built, the logs weren't burned through, and there were more stacked nearby ready to be added. Someone had been tending this fire very recently. I crouched down by the fire, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Who builds an entire settlement in the middle of nowhere and then just walks away from everything they own? Were they coming back? Where did they go? That's when I heard it, slow cracking sounds coming from beyond the edge of the camp, like someone stepping on branches, not quick or rushed, just steady, deliberate. I didn't run. Running through unknown forest at night is a good way to break an ankle or worse. But I walked away as fast as I could, not looking back, retracing my steps to the main trail. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, but there was nothing, just the occasional night sounds of the forest. I ended up spending the rest of the night at my usual overlook spot. I couldn't bring myself to go home, like if I left the forest, I'd never know what happened back there. I sat on my usual rock, drinking cold coffee from my thermos with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, waiting for the sun to come up. I've never felt so relieved to see daylight. I couldn't stop thinking about the settlement for days afterward. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was some kind of homeless encampment. But why would homeless people go so deep into the woods, far from any resources? And why would they leave all their stuff? 5 days later, I went back. It was mid-afternoon, bright sunlight filtering through the trees. I needed to see the place in daylight to confirm I hadn't imagined the whole thing or exaggerated it in my mind. When I reached the hollow and the spot where the settlement had been, it was gone. Completely gone. Every shelter, every tarp, every scrap of evidence that people had lived there vanished. The only thing left was the burned-out tire in the center where the fire had been. The ground around it was disturbed like things had been dragged away, but other than that, there was no sign that dozens of makeshift homes had stood there just days before. I spent hours searching the area. I looked for trails that might show where things had been carried out, footprints, anything. But the forest floor is mostly pine needles and doesn't hold tracks well. Whatever happened, whoever lived there had cleared out completely, taking every trace of their existence with them. I've gone back several times since then, hoping to find some clue I missed. Nothing. It's like the settlement never existed. But I know what I saw. I can still picture every detail of those shelters, the half-rolled sleeping bag, the photograph pinned to the wall, the playing cards spilled from the backpack. I've tried researching the history of the area, looking for any stories about people living in the woods, but there's nothing. I asked a few of the older locals if they'd ever heard of people camping out there, but they just gave me those looks, the ones that say, "You shouldn't be in those woods, especially at night." I still go hiking, but I never take the left fork at that junction anymore. I can't. Every time I pass it, I feel this pull, like something's inviting me down into that hollow again. Sometimes I think I see flickering light through the trees, but I tell myself it's just my imagination. The questions keep me up at night. Who were those people? Why did they leave everything behind? Where did they go? And why can't I find any evidence they were ever there? I keep thinking about that photograph. The woman with the baby. Was she one of the people living there? Or was that picture all someone had left of their family? The thing that scares me most is the timing. They left everything, literally everything they owned, in the middle of the night. What makes people abandon their shelter, their few possessions, their memories, and disappear without a trace? What were they running from? And was it the same thing that I heard walking toward me that night in the dark? Story 10. I still don't have an explanation for what happened that night. I'm not the superstitious type, never have been. But there are things I've experienced that I just can't explain away with logic, no matter how hard I try. This happened about 3 years ago when I was living on my family property in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. Our house was this old colonial-style place, nothing fancy, just a typical South African farm residence with a tin roof and a wraparound porch. Behind the main house was a narrow scullery, basically a glorified hallway with some countertops and a sink that connected to a small rent house where my brother Ryan and his girlfriend Lindy lived. I'd gone to visit them that evening for dinner and a few beers. It was the rainy season, and that night the sky had absolutely opened up. The rain was hammering against the tin roof so loudly we had to raise our voices just to hear each other. Time got away from us, and before I knew it, it was nearly midnight. "You should probably head back before the storm gets worse," Ryan said, glancing out the window at the sheets of rain. I didn't want to leave. Not because I was having such a great time, but because I'd have to walk through that damn scullery. I know it sounds ridiculous, a grown man afraid of a hallway, but there was something about that narrow passage that always gave me the creeps, even in daylight. At night, absolute nightmare. The electricity in the scullery had been spotty for months, something about the wiring being old and affected by moisture. Ryan kept saying he'd fix it, but he never did, so most nights, that passageway was pitch black. "Yeah, all right," I reluctantly agreed. "Hand me that torch by the door." Ryan looked over at the hook where the flashlight usually hung. "Shit. I think Lindy used it earlier when she was looking for something in the shed. I forgot to bring it back in." "Great. Just great." "I'll use my phone," I said, pulling it out, only to see the battery at 5%. Perfect timing. With a quick goodbye, I stepped out into the scullery. The door closed behind me, and immediately I was engulfed in darkness. The kind of darkness that feels physical, like it's pressing against your eyeballs. I turned on my phone's flashlight, but the battery was so low it gave off only the faintest glow, barely illuminating a meter ahead of me. It was cold in there, colder than it should have been given the mild night. I could hear the rain hammering on the tin roof above, creating this constant background roar. The sound of water dripping through a leak somewhere added an irregular rhythm. I kept my hand against the wall as I moved forward, counting my steps as I always did. 15 steps from Ryan's door to mine. I'd made it to 7 when my phone died completely. Just blinked out, leaving me in absolute darkness. "Shit," I muttered under my breath, trying to keep my cool. I stood completely still for a moment, letting my eyes adjust, but it didn't help. There were no windows in the scullery, nothing to let in even the faintest bit of light. I continued forward slowly, both hands on the wall now, feeling my way. 9 steps, 10, 11. That's when I felt something wrong. A change in the air pressure, like when you open a door to the outside, but I hadn't reached my door yet. 3 more cautious steps and my outstretched hand met empty air where the wall should have continued. I froze. I'd reached the door to the main house, but it was already open. Wide open. I distinctly remembered closing and locking it before I'd left for Ryan's place earlier that evening. I always did. We all did. It was just what you did in rural South Africa, standing there in the pitch, darkness, hand extended into the empty space where my closed door should have been. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The rain was even louder here, closer to the outside. I could feel a cool breeze coming in, bringing with it the smell of wet earth and something else. Something musty and unpleasant. I was about to step through the doorway when it happened. Something small and wet brushed forcefully against my leg. It wasn't a gentle brush. It was deliberate, firm, like an animal rubbing itself against me. But it wasn't a cat or a dog. Whatever touched me was low to the ground, maybe reaching just above my ankle, and its fur was soaking wet. I jerked back instinctively, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. "Hello?" I called out stupidly, as if whatever had touched me might answer. There was no response, just the continuing downpour of rain. But then I heard it, a sound that still haunts me when I think about it. From just beyond the doorway came the sound of stones being violently scattered, like something small but powerful was kicking or throwing the decorative river rocks we had lining the garden path. The sound was frantic, angry even. I didn't think. I didn't try to investigate. Some primal part of my brain screamed danger, and I reacted. I lunged forward, grabbed the door handle, and slammed it shut with all my strength. My trembling hands fumbled with the lock until I heard the satisfying click of the bolt sliding into place. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. For several minutes, I just stood there in the kitchen, listening. The rain continued to pour, but I couldn't hear any more sounds of stones being scattered. Eventually, I worked up the courage to turn on the kitchen light. The sudden brightness made me squint, but there was immense comfort in being able to see again. I quickly checked all the other doors and windows in the house, all locked just as they should be. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was probably just a stray cat that had somehow gotten in through the open door, spooked itself, and run off. The stones could have been displaced by the heavy rainfall. There were logical explanations, but if that was true, why was I so terrified? Why did every instinct in my body tell me that whatever had touched me in the darkness wasn't something natural? I couldn't bring myself to go back outside to check, not even to call Ryan. Instead, I retreated to my bedroom, double-checking that my windows were secure before climbing into bed fully clothed. I didn't sleep much that night. Morning came with clear skies and sunshine that made the events of the previous night seem like a bad dream. I might have convinced myself it was just my imagination, except for the rash. I noticed it when I got up to shower. Right where the wet fur had brushed against my leg was an angry red rash. It was perfectly defined, about the size of my palm and hot to the touch. It wasn't itchy, but it stung slightly when I ran water over it. "What the hell?" I muttered, examining it closer. The skin was raised and inflamed in a pattern that somehow didn't look random. I couldn't quite make out a shape, but it felt deliberate. I showed it to Ryan later that morning after telling him what happened. "That's weird," he said, frowning as he looked at my leg. "You sure you didn't just scratch yourself on something in the dark? And what about the door being open and the sounds I heard?" Ryan shrugged. "Maybe you didn't close it properly and the wind blew it open. As for the sounds, could have been anything. A mongoose, a bush baby." All sorts of nocturnal wildlife around here. I wanted to believe him, but the rash on my leg seemed to burn hotter every time I dismissed the experience as something ordinary. That afternoon, I drove into town to the local pharmacy. The pharmacist, an older man named Desmond, who'd lived in the area his whole life, took one look at my rash and his expression changed. "How did you get this?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. I hesitated, then gave him a sanitized version of events. That I'd felt something brush against me in the dark and woke up with this rash. Desmond's gaze lingered on my leg for a long moment before he looked up at me. "Where exactly were you when this happened?" "In the scullery between our main house and the rent house." He nodded slowly. "A threshold space, not quite one place or another." "What do you mean?" Instead of answering directly, he asked, "Have you had any trouble with the neighbors? Any disputes or bad blood?" The question seemed to come out of nowhere. "No, nothing like that." "Why?" Desmond sighed and handed me a tube of cream. "Put this on twice a day. It should help with the inflammation." He hesitated, then added, "You might want to talk to Mama Noluvo. She lives in the township just outside of town. She knows about these things." "What things?" I pressed. Desmond lowered his voice. "Tokoloshi." I'd heard the word before. It was part of local folklore, but I'd never given it much thought. "You're saying a mythical creature gave me a rash?" He didn't smile. "I'm saying there are things in this land older than our understanding. Mama Noluvo can tell you more." I wanted to laugh it off, but the absolute seriousness in his eyes stopped me. I paid for the cream and left, telling myself I was being ridiculous for even considering visiting some local traditional healer about a simple rash. But that night, the rash got worse. It spread slightly and began to throb with my heartbeat. And I started having dreams, terrible dreams of something small and wet, trying to get into the house, scratching at the windows, whispering my name. 2 days later, I found myself driving to the township, asking directions to Mama Noluvo's house. She was an elderly woman with bright, alert eyes that seemed to look straight through me. I didn't even have to explain why I was there. She glanced at my leg and nodded as if confirming something she already knew. "Tokoloshi," she said simply, gesturing for me to sit. "What exactly is a tokoloshi?" I asked, perching awkwardly on a wooden stool in her small living room. "A water spirit," she explained. "Small, like a child but not a child. Sometimes visible, sometimes not. They do the bidding of those who summon them." A chill ran through me. Someone summoned it? To do what? "To bring harm," she said matter-of-factly. "Someone has set this spirit against you or your family. It touched you to mark you." The description matched perfectly with what I'd experienced, a small, wet creature that had deliberately touched me in the darkness. The open door, the scattered stones, the rash, it all suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. "But why? We haven't had problems with anyone." Mama Noluvo shrugged. "Jealousy, greed, old grudges you may know nothing about. The reasons are often hidden." She gave me a small pouch of herbs to burn in the house and a special mixture to apply to my rash. As I was leaving, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Do not allow it inside again," she warned. "If it marks you a second time, it claims more than your skin." I nodded, thanked her, and left quickly. Part of me still wanted to dismiss it all as superstition, but a growing part of me couldn't ignore the evidence. The rash was real, the experience was real, and the fear I felt was definitely real. That night I burned the herbs in every room of the house, paying special attention to doorways and windows. The smell was pungent and earthy, filling the house with fragrant smoke. I applied the mixture to my rash, wincing at the initial sting before a cooling sensation spread across my inflamed skin. Ryan thought I'd lost my mind. "Seriously? You're buying into this mumbo-jumbo?" "Just covering all bases," I replied, not meeting his eyes. The rash began to fade over the next few days. The dreams stopped too. But I never felt safe in that scullery again, especially at night. I'd run through it as quickly as possible, always with a powerful flashlight. I'd check and double-check that the door was locked before sunset. We moved off the property about 6 months later. Ryan claimed it was because he and Lindy wanted to be closer to town, but I think he'd started to feel it too, a wrongness in the air, a sense of being watched. I still have a faint discoloration on my leg where the rash was. Sometimes, especially when it rains heavily, it seems to darken slightly, as if remembering. I've researched the Tokoloshe extensively since then, finding similar accounts across South Africa and neighboring countries. Similar descriptions of small, wet creatures that leave illness and strange marks in their wake. I don't know if what touched me that night was really a water spirit summoned by a witch with malicious intent. I don't know if there's a rational explanation for what happened. All I know is that something reached out from the darkness and marked me, and nothing has felt quite the same since. Story 11. I still can't sleep right. It's been 3 days since my hike, and every time I close my eyes, I see those pale eyes staring back at me. I'm writing this down because I need someone to believe me. My friends just laugh it off. Morgan saw Bigfoot. But what I saw wasn't Bigfoot. It was something much worse. I've been hiking the Blackwater Ridge trails for years. It's about 40 minutes from my house, far enough from the city that you get real wilderness, but close enough that I can go for an afternoon without making a whole day of it. I know those trails like the back of my hand, which is why what happened feels even more wrong. Last Thursday, I decided to take advantage of the perfect weather. 65 degrees, clear sky, light breeze. I packed my usual day bag, 2 water bottles, trail mix, first aid kit, extra socks, my pocket knife, and my phone. I told my roommate I'd be back before dinner, which I always do when hiking alone. Safety first and all that. I got to the trailhead around 2 in the afternoon. The parking lot was empty except for one truck that belonged to the park ranger. I signed the trail register and headed out on the Pine Ridge Loop, planning to add the summit extension if I had time. 5 miles total, moderate difficulty. Nothing I haven't done 100 times before. The first hour was perfect. The fall colors were just starting to show, and the sunlight filtering through the canopy made everything glow gold and amber. I stopped to photograph a few interesting mushrooms and spotted a family of deer about 50 yards off the trail. Normal forest stuff. I felt that familiar peace that comes from being alone in nature, the whole reason I go hiking in the first place. Around 3:30, I reached the creek crossing that marks the halfway point of the loop. I sat on my usual boulder to have some trail mix and water. That's when I first noticed something felt off. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels rustling in the underbrush, nothing. Just the sound of the creek and my own breathing. I've been in the woods enough to know that sudden silence usually means a predator is nearby. Typically a coyote or maybe a black bear. Nothing to panic about, but something to be aware of. I packed up my snack and continued on, figuring whatever animal was around would keep its distance. The trail gets steeper after the creek, climbing up through increasingly dense forest. The trees get older and bigger, blocking more of the sunlight. It's usually my favorite section of the hike, but that day the shadows felt heavier somehow. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept hiking, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the silence persisted. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the crunch of my boots on the trail and my slightly elevated breathing. I started walking faster. About 20 minutes past the creek, the trail opens into a small clearing before continuing up the ridge. I stopped there to check my map and have some water, trying to decide if I had time for the summit extension or if I should just complete the loop and head back. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just movement in my peripheral vision, maybe 70 yards away at the edge of the clearing where the underbrush gets thick again. I turned slowly, thinking it might be a deer. It wasn't. What I saw standing there, half hidden among the trees, was nothing like any animal I've ever encountered. It was tall. God, it was tall. At least 7 feet, maybe more. Its proportions were all wrong. 2 long limbs on a body that seemed simultaneously emaciated and powerful. It stood on 2 legs, but not straight up like a human. It had this hunched, loping posture, like its spine wasn't quite right. I froze completely. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. We just stared at each other across the clearing. That's when I noticed its skin, grayish and raw-looking, with patches of dark, matted fur clinging to it in uneven clusters. Like something suffering from severe mange, but worse. So much worse. Its face is what haunts me the most. An elongated snout filled with teeth that seemed too numerous, too jagged, and definitely too long for its mouth. They protruded at odd angles, like they'd grown without any natural constraint. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. Pale, almost white, with none of the warmth or mindlessness you see in animal eyes. There was intelligence there, cold, calculating intelligence that felt ancient and wrong. For what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds, we stared at each other. Then it moved. Not a startled movement like a deer about to bolt, but a deliberate, purposeful step toward me. That broke my paralysis. I ran. I didn't look back. Didn't stop for anything. I abandoned the trail loop and took the most direct route back to the parking lot, flying down the path so fast I nearly twisted my ankle multiple times. My lungs burned and branches whipped my face, but all I could think about was getting away from those eyes. I don't know if it followed me. I never looked back. The only sounds I could hear were my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. I kept expecting to feel claws or teeth at my back any second. When I finally burst out of the tree line and into the parking lot, I nearly collapsed from relief. The ranger's truck was gone, but my car sat there like a beacon of safety. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking so badly I dropped them twice before managing to unlock the door. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and sat there hyperventilating for a good 5 minutes. The parking lot and trailhead looked completely normal, peaceful even. Birds were singing again. Everything seemed fine, like what had just happened was impossible. But the scratches on my face from branches and the mud on my pants from where I'd slipped during my panicked flight were very real. I drove home in a daze, constantly checking my rearview mirror. When my roommate asked how the hike was, I mumbled something about not feeling well and went straight to my room. I couldn't explain what I'd seen. I still can't, not really. That night was the worst. Every sound made me jump. I kept my bedroom lights on and my door locked. I searched online for hours, looking for anything that might explain what I saw. Mange-ridden bears, wolves, some kind of sick moose. Nothing fit, nothing even came close. Some rational part of my brain keeps trying to convince me it was just a black bear with severe mange. Bears can stand on two legs after all. The problem is I've seen bears with mange in videos. This wasn't that. The proportions were all wrong. The way it moved was wrong. And those eyes, no bear has eyes like that. No animal I know of does. The next morning I called the ranger station. The woman who answered sounded bored as I tried to describe what I'd seen without sounding completely insane. She told me they hadn't had any unusual animal reports but would keep an eye out. She suggested it was probably a black bear and reminded me to always carry bear spray, which wasn't helpful at all. I tried telling a couple friends, but they either think I'm exaggerating or just saw a regular animal in poor lighting. One suggested I watched too many horror movies recently. Another joked about Bigfoot. Nobody takes it seriously. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. I've hiked those woods for years. I know what belongs there and what doesn't. That thing, whatever it was, doesn't belong in our world. It felt wrong on a fundamental level that's hard to explain. Last night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a sound outside my window. Probably just the wind or a raccoon in the trash cans, but I couldn't bring myself to look. All I could think about was those pale eyes staring back at me. I haven't been back to the trail. I don't think I ever will. Some part of me is afraid that if I return, it will be waiting for me. That our encounter wasn't random. That it somehow knew I was coming. The worst part is, I can't shake the feeling that it found me, not the other way around. That I didn't just stumble across it by accident. The way it looked at me felt, I don't know, like recognition, like it had been waiting. My roommate said my hiking boots were missing from the front door this morning. I assumed she'd moved them, but she swears she didn't touch them. I've looked everywhere. They're just gone. I'm writing this now because I need someone to believe me. I need to know I'm not crazy. Because every time I close my eyes, I see that thing taking one deliberate step toward me. And I can't help wondering, what if it's taking another step right now? What if it's been taking steps toward me ever since? I keep my blinds closed now. I double-check the locks on all the doors and windows before bed. I've started sleeping with my hiking knife under my pillow. It probably wouldn't help against that thing, but it makes me feel a little safer. I just heard something scratch at my bedroom window. I'm not going to look. I can't look. I don't want to see those eyes staring back at me from the darkness. I don't want to know if it followed me home. Story 12. I've always believed myself to be fairly level-headed in crisis situations. Growing up with 3 siblings taught me to stay calm when things got chaotic. But what happened last summer shook me to my core, and I still get anxious whenever storm clouds gather. My older brother Jake, 26, my 2 younger sisters Megan and Lily, 19 and 17, and I, 23, decided to have one final camping trip before returning to our respective lives. Work for Jake and me, college for Megan, and senior year for Lily. We chose Lake Pinewood, a spot our parents took us to every summer when we were kids. It was nostalgic, peaceful, and far enough from civilization to feel like a proper getaway. We arrived around 2 in the afternoon on a Saturday. The heat was oppressive, that sticky, heavy kind that makes your clothes cling to your skin within minutes. The lake looked inviting, though, glistening under the harsh sun. We found a nice clearing about 30 yards from the shoreline and set up our 2 tents, one for my sisters and one for Jake and me. The campsite was perfect, level ground, a pre-made fire pit, and just enough tree cover to provide some shade without blocking the view of the water. We spent the afternoon swimming and skipping rocks, then made hot dogs and s'mores as the sun set. The sunset that evening was breathtaking, vibrant oranges and pinks reflecting off the still lake water. I remember thinking how perfect everything was, how lucky we were to have this final adventure together. Around 10, we retired to our tents. Jake fell asleep almost immediately, but I stayed up reading by flashlight for about an hour before finally drifting off. I woke up sometime past midnight. At first, I couldn't figure out what had disturbed me. The air felt wrong, thick and unmoving, like someone had thrown a heavy blanket over our tent. There was a pressure in my ears that made them pop repeatedly. Jake was still sound asleep beside me, his breathing steady. I checked my phone, 2:17 a.m. Something compelled me to look outside. When I unzipped the tent flap, I froze. The sky had completely transformed. Earlier, when we'd gone to bed, it had been clear, with thousands of stars visible. Now it was pitch black, not just dark, but unnaturally so. The clouds hung low, almost touching the treetops, and there wasn't a single star to be seen. The lake, which had been calm all day, was now choppy with small whitecaps visible even in the darkness. I was about to wake Jake when the first lightning strike hit. It wasn't normal lightning. It didn't flash once and disappear. Instead, it strobed continuously for several seconds, illuminating everything in harsh, blinding light. The thunder followed immediately, so close and loud that I felt it in my chest. The ground literally shook beneath me. Jake jerked awake. "What the hell?" he mumbled, disoriented. "We've got a storm," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "A bad one." Before he could respond, the wind hit. It wasn't a gradual build-up. One moment there was eerie stillness, and the next, hurricane-force gusts were tearing through the trees. The air pressure dropped so suddenly that I felt dizzy. Our tent began to shake violently. The poles bent inward at alarming angles, and I could feel the stakes loosening from the ground as one side of the tent actually lifted upward. "We need to get out," Jake shouted over the wind. "Get to the car!" Through the open tent flap, I could see the other tent where my sisters were sleeping. It was already in worse shape than ours, with the fabric pulsating like it might tear at any moment. Then I heard them, Megan and Lily yelling something I couldn't make out. We scrambled to grab our phones and shoes. There was no time for anything else. The moment we unzipped the tent fully, a gust of wind nearly knocked me off my feet. Rain began to fall, not gentle drops, but horizontal sheets that stung my skin on impact. Lightning continued to strike, now directly hitting the lake repeatedly, creating bizarre spider webs of electricity across the water's surface. I shouted for my sisters, and they emerged from their tent, both in pajamas, clutching their phones. Megan had managed to grab her glasses, but Lily was squinting, nearly blind, without hers. We hunched against the wind and made for the car, which was parked on a small hill about 50 yards away. The journey to the car felt endless. Twice I nearly fell as my feet slipped in the rapidly forming mud. Branches and debris flew through the air around us. I kept my eyes on my sisters, terrified of losing sight of them in the chaos. When we finally reached the car, Jake's hands shook so badly he dropped the keys. I found them in a puddle and managed to unlock the doors. Once inside, we sat in stunned silence for a moment, all of us soaking wet and panting. The car rocked alarmingly with each gust of wind. Through the windshield, illuminated by near-constant lightning, we watched as one corner of our tent finally gave way. The entire structure tumbled across the clearing like some kind of bizarre parachute before snagging on a tree branch 20 feet up. "What the hell is happening?" Lily asked, her voice small and frightened. "The weather report said clear skies all weekend." "I don't know." Jake replied, starting the engine. "But we're not staying to find out." The decision to leave was unanimous. The storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it was intensifying. Lightning strikes were hitting every few seconds now, and trees were beginning to bend at worrying angles. I was genuinely afraid one might fall on us if we stayed. Driving out was a nightmare. The narrow dirt road that led to the main highway was already littered with fallen branches and debris. Jake drove painfully slowly, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles as the windshield wipers struggled against the deluge. A journey that normally took 7 minutes stretched to over 20 as we navigated around obstacles, the car hydroplaning several times on the flooded road. The strangest part, the storm seemed to follow us. Even as we reached the highway and drove toward our grandfather's house about 20 minutes away, the lightning and wind remained directly overhead. I kept checking the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see clear skies behind us, but there was only darkness and more storm clouds. We arrived at our grandfather's house around 3:30 in the morning. He was understandably shocked to find 4 soaking wet grandchildren on his doorstep, all of us still in our sleep clothes, wide-eyed and trembling. We explained what had happened as best we could, though it sounded unbelievable even to our own ears. "Tornado probably touched down near the lake," Grandpa said after hearing our story. "They can form quick in this part of the country, especially in summer. You kids were lucky to get out when you did." We slept fitfully in his spare rooms, all of us too wired to truly rest. I kept jerking awake, convinced I could still hear thunder. By the time morning came, the storm had passed completely. Looking outside revealed a clear blue sky, not a cloud in sight. If not for our still damp clothes and the mud caked on our shoes, it would have been easy to believe we'd imagined the whole thing. After breakfast, we decided to go back to the campsite to salvage whatever we could. Driving back, the evidence of the storm was everywhere. Downed power lines, trees stripped of leaves, scattered debris across yards. When we reached the entrance to Lake Pinewood, we found it partially blocked by fallen trees. A park ranger was directing traffic around the obstacle. We stopped to ask about the campgrounds. "Small F1 tornado touched down around midnight," he confirmed. "Damaged the North Shore campgrounds pretty bad. You folks weren't camping out there last night, were you?" When we told him we had been, his eyes widened. "You're lucky to be alive. We had to rescue 3 groups of campers who couldn't get out. One family's tent got picked up with their kid still inside, tossed him about 30 feet. He's okay, just some scrapes, but still." We were allowed to return to our site to collect our belongings. What we found was sobering. Our tent was still tangled in the tree, the poles bent beyond repair. The other tent was completely gone. We later found pieces of it scattered along the shoreline. Our camping chairs were crumpled like aluminum cans. The fire pit rocks had scattered, and there was a deep gouge in the earth where water had carved a channel directly through our campsite. Most unsettling of all, my sleeping bag was nowhere to be found. We searched the entire area and the surrounding woods, but it had simply vanished. Everything else was accounted for, even if damaged, but my sleeping bag was just gone. I still wonder sometimes where it ended up. In someone's yard miles away? At the bottom of the lake? It's an unsettling mystery. The ranger told us the weather station hadn't issued any severe warnings until just minutes before the tornado formed. A pop-up storm that intensified with unusual speed. The meteorologists were as surprised as anyone. It's been almost a year now, and I've developed an almost obsessive habit of checking weather forecasts. I have 3 different weather apps on my phone, and I get anxious if I'm more than 10 minutes from shelter when clouds gather. My siblings tease me about it, but they've changed too. Jake canceled a backcountry hiking trip he'd been planning for years. Lily sleeps with her window closed now, even on nice nights. The power of nature is something you don't truly understand until you've felt it trying to rip away your shelter, until you've seen familiar landscapes transformed into alien terrain in minutes. A tent wall is just fabric. A campsite is just borrowed space. When the sky decides to unleash its full force, the only reasonable response is to get out and find something solid to hide behind. Some lessons you only need to learn once. Story 13. I've never told anyone outside my family about this. Even now, my hands are shaking as I type this out. I guess I'm hoping someone here has experienced something similar or can help me make sense of what happened that day in Caramoan. I was 22 when it happened, working on my family's small farm in rural Caramoan, Philippines. It wasn't a big property, just enough land to grow vegetables and raise a few pigs to sustain us, with a little extra to sell at the local market. My parents were visiting relatives in the next village that day, so I was alone tending to our crops. It was late afternoon, maybe around 4 or 5 o'clock. The sun was still bright, but beginning its descent behind the mountains. The air was thick with humidity, making my clothes stick to my skin as I pulled weeds from our vegetable plot. The cicadas were singing their usual afternoon song, and occasional breezes would provide momentary relief from the heat. I remember feeling peaceful that day. The rhythm of farm work had always been comforting to me. Pull the weeds, check the plants, water where needed. Simple tasks that kept my hands busy and my mind calm. I was near the edge of our property, close to where our pigsty stood about 30 meters away. Beyond that was the beginning of the forest, dense, wild, and according to local legends, home to all manner of spirits and creatures. My grandmother had filled my childhood with stories of duende, dwarves, capre, tree giants, and other beings that supposedly inhabited the forests around our village. As a child, these tales terrified me. As I grew older, I dismissed them as superstition, the kind of folklore that helps explain the unexplainable in rural communities where education is limited. I was modern, practical. I'd even completed 2 years of college in the provincial capital before family finances forced me to return home. That day changed everything I thought I knew. I first noticed something was wrong when the pigs started making strange noises. Not their usual grunting or squealing, but distressed, almost panicked sounds. I looked up from my work, mildly annoyed at the interruption. We had 5 pigs at the time, 1 large sow, and 4 almost fully grown ones we were fattening to sell. They were valuable to us, representing several months of income, so I couldn't ignore their distress. The noise grew louder, more frantic. I stood up, wiping my hands on my work pants, and started walking toward the pigsty. That's when I saw it, and my entire body went cold despite the afternoon heat. Just outside the crude wooden pen stood what I can only describe as a tiny man. Not a child, not a person with dwarfism, but a perfectly proportioned adult male who stood no taller than my knees, maybe 60 centimeters at most. His skin was dark brown, almost like polished wood, and he wore what looked like simple clothing made of leaves or some plant material. His face was weathered, with deep lines that made him appear ancient despite his small stature. But what struck me most, what still haunts my dreams, was his strength. This tiny being had somehow managed to open our sturdy pen gate and was dragging one of our full-grown pigs by its hind legs. The pig must have weighed at least 70 kilos, yet this tiny creature pulled it effortlessly as if it were no heavier than a sack of rice. I froze, completely, utterly froze. My mind couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. It was so fundamentally wrong, so impossible, that my brain seemed to short-circuit. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even blink. I just stood there watching this impossible scene unfold before me. The tiny man didn't notice me at first. He was focused on his task, pulling our pig toward the forest edge. The animal wasn't struggling, which was strange in itself. It seemed almost in a trance, making only weak protests as it was dragged across the dirt. When the tiny man reached the edge of the forest, about 15 meters from where I stood paralyzed, he seemed to sense my presence. He turned his head slowly, and our eyes met. His eyes, they weren't human. They were entirely black, like polished stones, with no whites visible. And they held such ancient intelligence that I felt like I was looking at something that had existed for centuries. In that moment, I understood with absolute certainty that I was seeing something that shouldn't exist in our world. He stared at me for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Then, without any apparent effort, he hoisted the pig, which must have been many times his weight, onto his shoulder and simply walked into the forest. Not quickly, not rushing, just a casual pace, as if carrying something no heavier than a bag of groceries. I don't know how long I stood there after he disappeared into the trees. Could have been minutes, could have been an hour. Eventually my legs gave out, and I collapsed to my knees in the dirt. My entire body was trembling uncontrollably. I couldn't catch my breath. I felt cold sweat dripping down my back despite the tropical heat. When I finally managed to move again, I ran to our house and locked myself inside. I didn't go near the forest or even look out the windows. I sat in the middle of the floor, clutching a kitchen knife, jumping at every sound until my parents returned home after dark. Of course, they noticed the missing pig immediately. I tried to explain what happened, my words tumbling out in a confused mess. My father's initial anger at losing valuable livestock quickly turned to concern as he realized how genuinely terrified I was. My mother crossed herself repeatedly as I described the tiny man. "Nuno sapunso," she whispered, referring to the dwarf-like creatures said to live in anthills or mounds in Filipino folklore. According to our beliefs, they can bring fortune or misfortune, depending on how they're treated. Stealing livestock was definitely not typical behavior attributed to them in the stories I'd heard, though. My father tried to be practical. Maybe it was just a small man from the next village. Maybe you misjudged his size because you were far away. But I knew what I'd seen, the impossible strength, those inhuman eyes, the casual way he disappeared with our pig. No human could have done that. The following day, my father and several men from our village searched the surrounding forest. They found no trace of our pig, no blood, no tracks, nothing. Just at the forest edge, they discovered something that silenced the few who had been skeptical of my story. A perfect set of footprints, exactly like a man's but tiny, leading into the forest before disappearing entirely. This wasn't the first strange occurrence in our area. Over the years, other families had reported livestock disappearing, strange lights in the forest, voices calling their names at night. My grandmother claimed to have seen similar tiny people when she was young, but seeing it myself, experiencing that bone-deep certainty that I was witnessing something outside natural law, it changed me. I couldn't sleep for weeks afterward. Every noise outside our house made me jump. I refused to work near the forest edge or tend to the remaining pigs. The memory of those black, ancient eyes looking into mine haunted me day and night. When I did sleep, I dreamed of being dragged into the forest by impossibly strong hands. My parents became worried about my mental state. I lost weight. I couldn't concentrate. Eventually, they decided I should go stay with my aunt in Naga City, away from our village and its forest. The distance helped, but I never fully recovered my sense of security. That incident happened 8 years ago. I now live in Melbourne, Australia, working as a nurse aide. When people ask why I left the Philippines, I talk about economic opportunities and building a better life. I don't mention the real reason, that I couldn't bear to live in a place where the boundary between our world and something else felt so terribly thin. Sometimes my Australian friends share ghost stories or talk about paranormal experiences, and they seem so innocent compared to what I witnessed. A creaking floorboard, a glimpse of a shadow, a cold spot in a room. They have no idea what real terror is, seeing something that fundamentally breaks your understanding of reality. I've researched similar encounters since then. There are stories from all over the Philippines about duende and other small folk. Some accounts even describe them having unusual strength. But none exactly match what I saw that day. Some nights when I can't sleep, I still wonder about that tiny man. Was he alone, or are there more like him in the forests? What did he want with our pig? Was it food or something else? And most disturbing of all, how many other impossible things exist in the world that we refuse to see or acknowledge? I've never returned to our family farm, and I don't think I ever will. My parents still live there, though they've since rebuilt the pigsty closer to the house and never leave the animals unattended. They've never reported seeing the tiny man again, but sometimes they mention strange noises from the forest at night. As for me, even here in my small Melbourne apartment, thousands of kilometers from that forest in Caramoan, I still check my locks twice before bed. I still avoid being outside after dark. And whenever I see something from the corner of my eye, some small movement just at the edge of my vision, my heart stops for a moment. Because once you've seen something impossible, you can never unsee it. You can never fully convince yourself that the world is normal and safe again. You'll always be waiting, watching for the next glimpse of something that shouldn't exist, and wondering what else might be out there just beyond the trees. Story 14. I still get the chills thinking about what happened at Harrison Lake 10 years ago. I was only 12 at the time, but that night changed how I look at the wilderness forever. It was August, and my dad had organized this camping trip with his buddies to celebrate his friend Gary's 40th birthday. There were 5 of us total: my dad, me, Gary, and 2 other guys from Dad's work, Mike and Paul. Dad had been taking me camping since I was little, but this was the first time we'd gone to Harrison Lake in British Columbia. The place is absolutely gorgeous. Crystal clear water, surrounded by these massive mountains with Douglas firs and cedars that seem to touch the sky. Dad was big on what he called proper wilderness camping. No tents, just sleeping bags under the stars. "You can't really experience nature with walls around you, Trev," he'd always say. I'd done it enough times that it didn't bother me, and honestly, I loved falling asleep looking at the stars. We hiked about 3 miles in from where we parked, following this little stream that emptied into the lake. Dad and Gary had scouted the spot earlier that summer, and they found this perfect little clearing. Flat ground, a fire ring someone had made with rocks, and the stream right there for water. I remember being surprised by how quiet it was. Usually in forests, there's constant noise, birds, insects, rustling leaves. But this place had this weird stillness to it. Dad said it was because we were in such deep wilderness, but looking back, maybe that should have been our first warning. We spent the day doing typical camping stuff, setting up our site, collecting firewood, and rigging up our food in a bear bag suspended between two trees. Dad was always strict about that. All food, toiletries, anything with a scent had to go up in the bear bag at least 100 feet from where we slept. Bears have incredible noses, he'd lecture. They can smell food from miles away. I'd heard it a million times, but that night we followed all the rules to the letter. By evening, we'd caught some trout from the stream, cooked them over the fire, and were sitting around telling stories. Gary was in the middle of some elaborate tale about a fishing trip gone wrong when Mike pulled out a flask of whiskey as a birthday surprise. The adults passed it around while I sipped on hot chocolate, watching the fire die down to embers. When it was time to sleep, we arranged our sleeping bags in a rough circle around the dead fire. Dad positioned us so I was between him and this big fallen log, which felt safe and cozy. Gary was directly across from us, with Mike and Paul filling in the circle. I remember the sleeping bag feeling extra warm that night, and the sounds of the guys occasionally snoring made me feel protected, like nothing could go wrong with these grown men around me. I drifted off easily, tired from the day's hiking and swimming. But sometime in the middle of the night, it must have been around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. There wasn't any specific sound that woke me. No crack of a twig or rustle of leaves. It was more like an instinct, a feeling that something wasn't right. I lay completely still in my sleeping bag, barely breathing. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects chirping, no wind in the trees, just absolute stillness. I remember straining my ears, trying to hear anything beyond the soft snores of the men around me. Nothing. I was too scared to sit up and look around. Instead, I turned my head very slowly to check on my dad. He was fast asleep, his back to me. I wanted to wake him, to tell him something felt wrong, but 12-year-old me was too embarrassed to seem like a scared kid. So I just lay there, heart pounding, for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 or 20 minutes. Eventually the forest sound slowly returned, a distant owl, the gentle gurgle of the stream, and I managed to fall back asleep, convincing myself it was just my imagination. The next morning I woke to the sound of hushed, urgent voices. I opened my eyes to see Gary, Mike, and Paul standing a few feet away, looking at something on the ground. Dad was already up too, walking over to join them. I climbed out of my sleeping bag and padded over in my socks. "Trevor, stay back," Dad said, but it was too late. I'd already seen it. There, barely 2 feet from where Gary's head had been all night, was a massive pile of fresh bear scat. Not just any scat. This was huge, steaming in the cool morning air, clearly left by a full-grown bear, and around it, pressed into the soft forest floor, were unmistakable paw prints, massive ones. "Jesus Christ," Mike whispered, following the tracks with his eyes. "It walked right through our camp." The prints told the whole story. The bear had come from the direction of the stream, walked right up to where Gary was sleeping, stood there long enough to do its business, and then continued through our camp and back into the forest. The tracks passed within inches of each of our sleeping bags. Gary's face had gone completely white. "It stood right next to my head," he said, his voice shaking. "Right next to my head." He kept repeating it, like he couldn't process what had happened. I followed the paw prints with my eyes, and that's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. One of the prints was right beside my sleeping bag, on the side away from the log. The bear had stood right next to me too, close enough that if I'd reached my arm out, I could have touched it. Dad put his hand on my shoulder and squeezed hard. "Pack up," he said quietly. "We're leaving." No one argued. The thing that scared me most wasn't just that a bear had wandered through our camp. It was how completely silent it had been. This massive predator, probably weighing hundreds of pounds, had walked among 5 sleeping humans without making a sound that would wake us. How was that even possible? In that moment, I understood something about nature that no book or documentary could have taught me. We were just visitors here, and sometimes the true owners of the forest come to remind us of that fact. We packed up in record time. No one spoke. No coffee was made, no breakfast eaten. We just stuffed our sleeping bags into their sacks, grabbed our backpacks, and started hiking out. The light-hearted mood from the previous day was completely gone, replaced by a tense silence broken only by the sound of our boots on the trail. About halfway back to the car, Mike finally spoke up. "Black bear, you think?" he asked no one in particular. "Track size matches a grizzly," Dad replied quietly. "Probably a male, given the size of the scat." Gary made a strangled sound that might have been a laugh. "Fantastic. A male grizzly took a dump next to my head, and I slept through it." We made it back to the car in half the time it had taken us to hike in. As we loaded our gear, I noticed Gary's hands were still shaking. "I'm done," he announced suddenly. "No more wilderness camping for me. Next time I sleep outdoors, it'll be in an RV park with rangers and fences." No one gave him a hard time about it. We all understood. On the drive home, Dad tried to reassure me. "Bears usually avoid humans, Trevor. We got lucky. It wasn't interested in us, just passing through." But I couldn't shake the memory of waking up in the night, that feeling of wrongness, the unnatural silence. Had I sensed the bear's presence somehow? Had it already been in our camp when I woke up? The thought made me shiver. That was 10 years ago. I still go camping, can't give up the outdoors completely, but I've never again slept without a tent. And I always position myself so my back is to something solid, never to the open forest. Dad thinks I'm being paranoid, but he didn't wake up that night. He didn't feel what I felt. The weirdest part is how that night changed my perception of silence. Most people find silence peaceful, but for me, absolute silence in the wilderness means only one thing. Something big enough to silence everything else is present, and that's terrifying. I've told this story to friends over the years, and they usually laugh it off. "You got a cool wildlife encounter story without any actual danger," they say. But they weren't there. They didn't see Gary's face that morning or the size of those paw prints. They don't understand how something that massive could move with such perfect ghost-like stealth. Sometimes when I'm hiking alone and the forest goes quiet, I freeze in place, remembering. I strain my ears just like I did that night, waiting for the sound that never comes. The sound of something huge that moves in complete silence. Because that's the thing about bears and nature in general. They don't need to announce themselves. They were here long before us, and they'll be here long after. We're just temporary guests in their home, and sometimes they come silently in the night to remind us of that fact. I've never been able to explain why I woke up that night, or why none of the adults did. Maybe kids are more tuned into their surroundings, or maybe I just got lucky. But one thing's for certain, that grizzly could have done whatever it wanted to us, and we would have been completely helpless. Instead, it just left its calling card and disappeared back into the wilderness, a midnight visitor we never saw but will never forget. Story 15. I've been camping alone for years. I love it more than anything. The solitude, the connection with nature, and the break from my noisy life in the city. I've camped in all kinds of weather, handled wildlife encounters, and navigated difficult terrain. I've always taken pride in being prepared for whatever might come my way. That was until 3 weeks ago, when I experienced something that has fundamentally changed how I see myself in relation to the natural world. I had been planning this trip to Lake Stillwater for months. It's about 4 hours from my house, nestled in a valley surrounded by dense pine forest. The forecast showed a chance of thunderstorms, but nothing severe, just your typical summer weather pattern. I've weathered plenty of storms in my tent before, so I wasn't concerned. I arrived at the campsite around 2 in the afternoon. The lake was gorgeous, crystal clear with that deep blue tint that makes you want to dive right in. There were a few other campers scattered around the lake's edge, but I found a nice secluded spot about 20 meters from the water. Perfect place to set up, with a small natural embankment behind my tent that would block the wind. I spent the afternoon swimming, hiking, and setting up camp. As evening approached, the other campers packed up to leave. Apparently, they were just day visitors. By sunset, I realized I had the entire lake to myself. That's exactly what I had wanted. Complete solitude. The evening was absolutely perfect. I built a small fire, cooked my dinner, and sat watching the sunset reflect off the lake. As darkness fell, the sky lit up with more stars than you can imagine. The frogs started their nightly chorus, and occasionally I'd hear an owl hooting in the distance. This is why I camp alone. These perfect, peaceful moments when you feel completely at one with the world around you. I crawled into my tent around 10, read for a bit with my headlamp, then drifted off to sleep to the sound of gentle breeze rustling through the trees. I woke up sometime around midnight, instantly aware something had changed. The air in my tent was stifling, hot and heavy, pressing down on me. I was drenched in sweat despite the cool temperatures that had been forecast. That sixth sense that outdoor people develop was screaming at me that something wasn't right. I unzipped my tent and poked my head outside. The transformation was shocking. The star-filled sky I'd fallen asleep under was completely gone, replaced by an oppressive blackness that seemed to swallow everything. Not a single star was visible. The only light came from my headlamp, and even that seemed dimmer somehow, as if the darkness was actively fighting against it. In the distance, I heard a low rumble of thunder. It didn't sound like normal thunder, though. It had a strange, almost mechanical quality to it. The air felt wrong, too, thick and electrically charged, making the hairs on my arms stand up. The lake, which had been so peaceful earlier, was now completely still. No ripples, no movement, like a sheet of black glass reflecting nothing. I remember checking my watch, 12:17 a.m., and wondering if I should pack up and try to hike back to my car. That's when the first lightning struck. It wasn't like normal lightning at all. Normal lightning gives you some warning, distant flashes, growing thunder. This bolt exploded directly overhead without any warning, a blinding white-blue crack that turned night into day for a split second. The thunder that followed wasn't just loud, it physically hit me like someone had punched me in the chest. I actually fell backwards into my tent. Before I could even process what had happened, another bolt hit, and another. Within seconds, the storm had gone from nothing to absolute chaos. The lightning was striking so frequently that it created this terrifying strobe effect, freezing the world in these disconnected snapshots of motion. Trees bending, rain suddenly appearing sideways in the air, debris flying past. The thunder wasn't separate claps anymore. It had become this continuous rolling roar that I could feel in my bones. It sounded like a freight train was passing directly overhead, but it didn't pass. It just kept coming and coming. I've never experienced a drop in air pressure like what happened next. My ears popped painfully, and it felt like something was pressing against my entire body. Then the wind hit. It wasn't wind like I've ever known it. This was something else entirely, a solid wall of air moving with such force that it instantly flattened one side of my tent. I heard my tent poles crack, and the rain fly tore free, disappearing into the night like it was made of tissue paper. The wind didn't blow in gusts. It was constant, screaming through the trees with a force that bent them sideways. I grabbed my phone and emergency kit purely on instinct, but I knew I couldn't stay in the tent. It was coming apart around me. I crawled out just as another lightning bolt struck the lake, so close that I saw the water explode upward in a plume before the light temporarily blinded me. What I saw in those strobe-like flashes of lightning will stay with me forever. The entire forest seemed to be in motion. Trees that had stood for decades were bent nearly horizontal. The lake's surface was being torn up by the wind, water spraying off it in sheets. Every lightning strike on the water sent up these massive, twisting shadows that made it look like something enormous was moving beneath the surface. I flattened myself against the small embankment behind where my tent had been, trying to find any protection from the wind and flying debris. The rain felt like needles against my skin, driven sideways with such force that it stung through my clothes. I couldn't hear anything except the wind and thunder, not even my own screams, which I'm pretty sure I was making. The most terrifying part was the sound the wind made. It wasn't just loud. It had this distinctive quality to it that I'd never heard before. The best way I can describe it is a ripping sound, like the air itself was being torn apart. It's the sound they try to recreate in movies about tornadoes, but it's so much worse in reality. This deep, resonant tearing that seems to vibrate inside your chest. Every time lightning struck, which was happening every few seconds now, it was like a bomb going off. The flash was so bright it hurt, and the sound was so loud I couldn't even process it as sound anymore, just pure physical impact. I remember pressing myself into the dirt, covering my head with my arms, and being absolutely certain I was going to die. I don't know how long the worst of it lasted. Time gets weird in situations like that. It could have been 5 minutes or 30. It felt like hours. Eventually, I became aware that the time between lightning strikes was growing longer. The continuous roar of thunder started to break up into distinct claps again. The wind was still incredibly strong, but no longer felt like it was trying to tear me off the ground. I stayed pressed against that embankment until the storm finally moved past. The rain continued, but the worst was over. I was soaked to the bone, shivering uncontrollably, and surrounded by the wreckage of my campsite. My tent was gone, completely gone, except for one bent pole stuck in the ground like a broken flag. I curled up against the embankment, wrapped in my emergency blanket, and waited for dawn. I couldn't stop shaking, and it wasn't just from the cold. I kept hearing that tearing sound in my head, seeing those unnatural shadows on the lake with each lightning flash. When morning finally came, The devastation was shocking. Trees were down everywhere, including a massive pine that had snapped about 30 meters from where I'd been huddled. It had fallen directly across the trail I would have taken to get back to my car. If I'd tried to leave during the storm, I would have been directly in its path. As I hiked out that morning, picking my way through fallen trees and debris, I met a park ranger who was checking the area. He told me a tornado had touched down just 2 kilometers east of where I'd been camping. It had completely leveled another campsite that thankfully had been empty. The campers had left the day before due to the forecast. "You're lucky to be alive," he said. I knew he was right. It wasn't skill or experience or preparation that had kept me alive. It was pure luck that the tornado hadn't shifted direction slightly. If it had, no amount of outdoor knowledge would have saved me. It's been 3 weeks now, and I'm still processing what happened. I've been camping since I was a kid. I still love the outdoors, and I'll still go camping. But something fundamental has changed in how I see myself in relation to nature. Before this, I had this subtle belief that with enough gear, enough knowledge, enough experience, I could handle whatever came my way. That storm stripped away that illusion completely. When nature truly unleashes its power, we are nothing. All our preparation, all our technology, all our knowledge, it means nothing in the face of that raw force. I can still hear that tearing sound when I close my eyes at night. I can still see those bizarre shadows on the lake with each lightning strike. I still feel the pressure drop in my nightmares. That moment when the air itself seemed to compress around me before unleashing hell. I survived, but not because of anything I did. I survived because I wasn't in the direct path, nothing more. And that knowledge has changed everything. Story 16. I've been sitting here for 2 hours trying to figure out how to even start this. My hands are still shaking as I type. It's been 3 weeks since that camping trip, and I still wake up in the middle of the night feeling like my mattress is sinking beneath me. I've been camping since I was a kid. Nothing fancy, just basic outdoor skills my dad taught me. This particular trip was supposed to be my escape from a hellish month at work. I'd just gone through a brutal project deadline and a breakup, so I needed to get away from everything. No cell service, no people, just me and the woods. I usually camp at Pinewood State Park, but this time I wanted somewhere more isolated. I drove about 2 hours north of my usual spot to this area that's mostly used by logging companies and survey teams. The park ranger I talked to before heading out actually raised an eyebrow when I mentioned where I was going. He said, "Not many folks camp up there, but the view's worth it if you're willing to hike." I should have taken that as my first warning. My gear wasn't anything special, just a hand-me-down tent from my brother with more duct tape than original fabric, hiking boots that had seen better days, and this old Coleman lantern that was perpetually covered in soot no matter how many times I cleaned it. I packed light, some protein bars, crackers, jerky, a small propane stove, water filter, the basics. The hike-in was rough, about 4 hours uphill on what barely qualified as a trail. By the time I found a suitable campsite, the sun was already starting to set. The spot seemed perfect, though, a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, flat ground, and even a natural stone circle someone had previously used for a fire. I set up camp, feeling that peaceful exhaustion that comes after a good day of hiking. The first night was exactly what I needed. The silence was incredible. Not the silence of a quiet apartment or even a regular campsite. This was deep silence, only broken by the occasional breeze through the trees. I remember thinking how strange it was that I didn't hear any wildlife. No owls, no rustling of nocturnal animals, nothing. But I was too tired to worry about it, and I slept like a rock. The next morning, I woke up feeling refreshed. The air was crisp and everything was still quiet. After breakfast, I walked about 20 yards from my campsite to relieve myself. That's when I noticed something odd, a patch of disturbed soil, maybe about the size of a dinner plate. It wasn't like something had dug into it, more like something had pushed up from underneath. The soil was loose and formed a slight mound. I figured it was probably a mole or some other burrowing animal and didn't think much of it. I spent the day hiking around, exploring the area, taking some photos of the incredible views, but around mid-afternoon I started feeling uneasy. Nothing specific happened, just this gradual sense that something was off. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, which I chalked up to being completely alone in unfamiliar territory. When I got back to camp, I noticed I wasn't very hungry, which was weird after a full day of hiking. I forced myself to eat some crackers and a protein bar, but my appetite was just gone. As the sun set, that uneasiness grew stronger. I built up the fire bigger than necessary, telling myself it was just to ward off the unusual chill in the air. That second night, I had trouble falling asleep. It was around 1 in the morning when I heard it, a sound like dirt shifting right next to my tent. Not leaves or branches rustling, not an animal scurrying, but the distinct sound of soil moving. It started on one side of my tent, then seemed to move around to the other side. Not like scratching, more like pressure being applied beneath the ground. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, heart pounding. Nothing was there. I circled the entire campsite twice, looking for any sign of an animal, but found nothing. I told myself it was probably just the ground settling, maybe some water runoff from a recent rain affecting the soil. I didn't sleep at all that night. When dawn broke, I stepped out of my tent and immediately saw it. Another patch of disturbed soil on the opposite side of my tent from the first one I'd found. It was almost identical in size and shape, like they were symmetrically positioned. That's when I knew something wasn't right. It seemed too deliberate, too precise. Still, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a type of fungus pushing up the soil, or some kind of geological process I didn't understand. I decided to take a short hike to clear my head, promising myself I'd head back home if I still felt uneasy by afternoon. The hike did nothing to calm my nerves. The forest seemed too quiet, too still. I only went about an hour out before turning back. When I returned to camp, everything looked exactly as I'd left it, yet somehow wrong. Like someone had moved everything slightly and put it back. I know that sounds crazy, but that's how it felt. I spent the rest of the day in camp, trying to read a paperback I'd brought, but mostly just staring at those two disturbed patches of soil. I considered packing up right then, but it was already late afternoon, and I didn't fancy navigating that difficult trail in the dark, so I decided to spend one more night. Big mistake. As night fell, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat up in my sleeping bag, flashlight and pocket knife within reach. Around midnight I heard it again, the sound of dirt moving, but this time it was different. There was a dull thud against the side of my tent, like something had pressed against it from below the ground. I froze, hardly breathing. About 20 minutes later, there was another thud, this time directly beneath where I was sitting. I swear I felt the ground shift beneath me, just slightly, like something was pushing up against the tent floor. I scrambled to the other side of the tent, heart racing so fast I thought I might pass out. I didn't sleep a wink that night, just sat there in the corner of my tent, watching the floor, listening for any sound. When the first light of dawn appeared, I unzipped the tent with shaking hands and looked at the spot where I'd been sitting. There it was, a fist-sized patch of loose soil exactly where I had been lying. I lost it then. I started throwing my gear into my backpack, not caring what got crushed or broken. I didn't bother with breakfast or even changing clothes. As I was breaking down my tent, I noticed something that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. There was a third disturbed patch of soil, right where my fire ring had been. It was as if something underground had pressed right up against the coals, watching me as I sat by the fire each night. That's when a terrifying thought hit me. These weren't random disturbances. Whatever was making them was tracking my movements. It knew where I was relieving myself the first day. It knew where my tent was the second day. And now it knew where I slept and where I sat. It was mapping me. I abandoned half my gear, grabbed just my backpack with essentials, and ran. I didn't follow the trail. I just headed downhill as fast as I could. I fell 3 times, scraping my hands and knees badly on the second fall, but I barely felt it. I just kept running and stumbling until I reached my truck 4 hours later, out of breath and practically hyperventilating. I haven't been camping since. I can't even sleep with my windows open anymore. I've tried telling a couple of friends about what happened, but they just think I freaked myself out alone in the woods. Maybe they're right. Maybe it was all in my head. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. Whatever was making those soil disturbances wasn't acting blind. It wasn't randomly searching. It knew exactly where I was. It was learning my patterns. And I can't shake the feeling that if I'd stayed one more night, it would have been ready to do more than just push up the soil beneath me. I called the ranger station a week later, trying to sound casual, asking if there had been any reports of unusual ground disturbances in that area. The ranger just laughed and said, "That whole area is riddled with old mining tunnels from the 1900s. Ground shifts all the time up there." But I know what I experienced wasn't just the ground settling. Those patterns were too deliberate, too focused on me specifically. And sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I swear I can hear the faint sound of dirt shifting beneath my apartment floor. Story 17. I've hiked my entire life. Since I was a kid, my dad would take me and my brothers camping, and I kept the habit going into adulthood. There's something about being alone in nature that helps me reset. So when life got overwhelming 6 months ago, layoffs at work followed by a breakup, I knew I needed to get away. Just me in the mountains for 3 days. I chose a trail in the northern part of the state that was challenging enough to keep my mind occupied, but not so demanding that I'd need to bring specialized gear. The weather forecast showed clear skies with mild temperatures, perfect hiking conditions. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, enough food, water purification tablets, first aid kit, and a satellite phone for emergencies. I'd planned everything meticulously, studying the trail maps for weeks to ensure I wouldn't get lost. The trailhead was about a 4-hour drive from my apartment. I left at dawn, arrived around 10 in the morning, and was on the trail by 10:30. The first few hours were exactly what I needed. The air was crisp, birds were singing, and the physical exertion of the hike was pushing all my stress away. By mid-afternoon, I'd covered about 8 miles of trail and was deep into the wilderness. I hadn't seen another person since shortly after the trailhead. I remember checking my watch around 4 in the afternoon. The sun was still up, but the light was starting to get that golden quality it gets before sunset. I'd found my rhythm and was making good time. so I decided to push a little further before setting up camp. According to my map, there was a small clearing ahead that would make a good spot to pitch my tent. That's when I first noticed the silence. At first, I couldn't put my finger on what felt wrong. Then it hit me. The forest had gone completely quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze. Just nothing. I've been in enough forests to know that sudden silence usually means a predator is nearby, typically a mountain lion or bear. I stopped walking and scanned my surroundings, trying to figure out what had spooked the wildlife. I didn't see anything unusual, so I continued more cautiously, making noise as I walked to avoid surprising any animals. After about 20 more minutes of hiking, the trail opened up into the clearing I'd been aiming for. It was maybe 100 feet across, covered in tall grass that swayed gently. The sun was hitting it just right, creating this peaceful little meadow surrounded by dense forest. That's when I saw it. On the far side of the clearing, partially hidden by the tree line, was a figure. My first thought was that it was another hiker, and I felt a mix of disappointment at not having the solitude I'd wanted, but also relief at encountering another human being after hours alone. I raised my hand to wave, but my arm froze halfway up. Something was wrong with the proportions of the figure. It was tall, much taller than a normal person, maybe 7 or 8 feet. Its shoulders were unnaturally broad and hunched forward. I squinted, trying to make out details through the dappled shadows at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't wearing clothes. That realization hit me like a punch to the gut. What I had initially taken for some kind of dark-colored jacket was actually its skin or hide. It had patches where fur should have been, but large areas were bare, showing grayish-pink flesh that looked diseased or injured. Its limbs were too long, with joints that didn't quite bend the right way. I stood completely still, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My mind raced through possibilities: bear with mange, some kind of deformed elk. But deep down, I knew it wasn't any animal I'd ever seen or read about. As if sensing my attention, the thing's head turned toward me. I couldn't make out its face clearly from that distance, but I could feel it looking at me. Then it made a sound, a low, guttural growl that started deep and rose to something almost like a whine before dropping again. The sound echoed across the clearing and seemed to vibrate through my chest. That sound snapped me out of my paralysis. I began to back away slowly, keeping my eyes on the figure. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I remembered all the wilderness training I'd had over the years. Running triggers a predator's chase instinct. So I moved as calmly as I could, step by step, back toward the forest edge I'd come from. The creature didn't immediately follow. It shifted its weight, seeming to sway slightly as it watched me retreat. There was something about its posture that felt deliberate, almost calculating. This wasn't just an animal reacting to a human presence. It felt like it was making decisions, considering options. Once I reached the tree line, I turned and walked quickly back down the trail, fighting the urge to sprint. After about half a mile, when I was certain the thing wasn't following, I stopped to catch my breath and think. The sun was getting lower, and I needed to make a decision. Going back the way I came would mean hiking 8 miles in fading light, which wasn't safe. Moving forward would take me closer to that thing in the clearing. I decided to set up camp where I was, just off the trail in a small flat area surrounded by dense underbrush. It wasn't ideal, but it offered some concealment and was far enough from the clearing to give me some peace of mind. I pitched my tent quickly, skipping dinner because my appetite was gone. I just wanted to get inside my tent and zip it up, as if that thin nylon could offer any real protection. As darkness fell, The forest sounds gradually returned. Crickets chirped, an owl hooted somewhere nearby, and a light breeze rustled through the trees. These normal sounds were comforting, and I started to rationalize what I'd seen. It must have been a bear with a severe case of mange, I told myself. The disease can make them lose most of their fur, and if it was standing on its hind legs, it might have appeared human-like from a distance. The strange proportions were just a trick of the light and my stressed mind. I was almost convinced by my own explanation when I heard it. The same growl from earlier, but closer now. It came from somewhere in the darkness beyond my tent. I froze in my sleeping bag, barely breathing. Then came another sound, a heavy dragging noise, like something large moving through the underbrush. The dragging continued, circling my campsite. Sometimes it would stop, and in those moments of silence, I could hear heavy breathing. Then the growl would come again, and the dragging would resume. This went on for hours, or what felt like hours. I had no way to check the time because my phone was in my backpack at the foot of the tent, and I was too terrified to move. At one point, something brushed against the side of my tent. The fabric bulged inward slightly, as if something was pressing against it. I bit my fist to keep from making any sound. The pressure moved slowly along the side of the tent, then disappeared. I spent the entire night wide awake, listening to that thing circle my campsite. Sometimes it would move farther away, and I'd think it was gone, only to hear it return from a different direction. The growls became less frequent as the night wore on, but the dragging sound continued intermittently. When the first light of dawn finally filtered through the trees, the sounds had stopped. I waited another hour, listening intently, before I cautiously unzipped my tent and peered out. The forest looked normal in the early morning light. Birds were singing, and a light mist hung between the trees. I packed up faster than I ever have before. I didn't bother with breakfast or even properly folding my tent. I just stuffed everything into my backpack as quickly as possible. As I was packing, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. All around my campsite, the underbrush was trampled in a circular pattern, as if something had been walking around my tent all night. There were no distinct footprints I could identify, just disturbed earth and broken twigs. But in one spot where the ground was softer, there was an indentation that looked nothing like any animal track I'd ever seen. It was large, maybe 15 inches long, with what looked like elongated toes. The impression wasn't deep enough to make out clear details, but it was definitely not a bear or any other known wildlife. I hit the trail immediately, no longer caring about making noise. I just wanted to get back to my car as quickly as possible. I practically jogged the entire way, stopping only when my lungs burned too much to continue. I didn't take the usual breaks to enjoy the scenery or take photos. I just kept moving. About 2 miles from the trailhead, I ran into a group of 3 hikers heading in. They looked cheerful and well-rested, exactly how I'd looked the day before. They greeted me, and one of them commented on how rough I looked. I must have been a sight, sweaty, wild-eyed, and probably pale as a ghost. They asked if everything was okay, and I hesitated. What could I possibly say? That I'd seen some kind of monster? That I'd spent the night listening to it circle my tent? They'd think I was crazy. Just didn't sleep well, I mumbled. Be careful out there. They exchanged glances, and one of them said, "Actually, we saw something weird about a mile back. Probably just a bear with mange, but it looked freaky, standing on its hind legs and everything." My heart nearly stopped. "Where exactly did you see it?" "Just off the trail near that rocky outcrop." The hiker pointed back the way they'd come. "It didn't seem aggressive, just watched us from the trees. We made noise like you're supposed to, and it moved off." I nodded numbly and warned them to be extra cautious. They thanked me and continued on their way, their voices fading as they headed deeper into the forest. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing. If they had seen it too, then it wasn't a hallucination, but a bear with mange. Could that really explain what I'd seen? The rest of the hike back to my car was a blur. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that tall, hunched figure following me. When I finally reached my car, I threw my backpack in the back seat and drove away as fast as I safely could. It's been 3 months since that hike, and I haven't been back to the mountains. I've spent hours researching bears with mange, looking at photos and videos. Some do look eerily humanoid when the disease is advanced and they stand upright. The rational part of my brain wants to accept this explanation, but I can't shake the memory of how it looked at me across that clearing, how it deliberately circled my tent all night, the way it moved, not like an animal driven by instinct, but like something with purpose. A bear wouldn't spend hours circling a campsite without either attacking or losing interest. I keep thinking about all those wilderness legends, skinwalkers, wendigos, and other forest creatures from folklore. Before my experience, I dismissed them as campfire stories. Now I'm not so sure. There might be things in the wilderness that defy conventional explanation. Whatever I encountered that day, it's changed how I see the forests I once loved. What should have been a healing escape into nature has instead left me with a fear I can't shake. I still hear that growl in my dreams, and I wake up thinking something is circling my bed, dragging itself through the darkness of my bedroom. Story 18. I just need to get this down somewhere because it's been 2 weeks and I still wake up in a cold sweat every night. I keep checking my doors and windows even though I'm 20 miles from those woods now. I've tried telling my roommate, but he thinks I'm being dramatic or that I was just dehydrated and panicking. I know what I saw. It was just supposed to be a normal Saturday hike. I've been dealing with a ton of stress from work lately, like the kind where you're checking emails at 3 a.m. and having stress dreams about your boss. My therapist suggested I try getting outdoors more, and I used to love hiking as a kid, so I figured why not hit the Erskine Woods Trail. It's about an hour from my apartment, not super popular but not completely remote either. Perfect for clearing my head without crowds of weekend warriors. I got there around noon. The parking lot only had 3 other cars, which should have been my first clue something was off. Erskine is usually busy this time of year with the leaves changing and everything. I remember checking my phone, full battery, weak signal but still there, before heading out. I had a small backpack with water, some trail mix, and a light jacket. Nothing serious since I only planned to do the main 6-mile loop. The weird thing is how normal everything felt at first. The trail was well marked with those blue blazes on the trees. I passed an older couple heading back to the parking lot about half an hour in. The woman smiled and said something about enjoying the quiet day. I remember nodding and thinking it was nice to have the trail mostly to myself. That's when I noticed it though. The quiet. Not the peaceful quiet you expect in nature, but a heavy silence that felt wrong. No birds, no squirrels. Even the wind seemed to have stopped rustling the leaves. I actually stopped walking and held my breath just to see if I could hear anything. Nothing. I've been in plenty of forests before, and they're never silent. There's always something, birds calling, insects buzzing, leaves rustling. But there was absolutely nothing here. It felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. I decided to keep going. I figured maybe there was a predator nearby that had scared off the wildlife, a coyote or something. Nothing to worry about. But then I realized I hadn't seen a blue trail marker for a while. I backtracked maybe 50 yards, trying to find the last marker I'd seen. Couldn't find it. Checked my phone to pull up the trail map, but now I had no signal at all. Not even one bar. And I couldn't seem to find the map I'd downloaded. This was around 2 in the afternoon, so I still had plenty of daylight, but a little knot of anxiety started forming in my stomach. I decided to just head back the way I came. Easy enough, right? Except after walking for 20 minutes, I realized the trail looked completely unfamiliar. The trees seemed closer together, darker somehow. The ground was changing too, more uneven, with roots snaking across what should have been a clear path. That's when I noticed the bark on the trees. It looked wrong, twisted, with these deep grooves that almost looked like faces if you stared too long. I told myself I was just getting freaked out and seeing things, but I swear the patterns weren't normal, and some of the trees seemed to be leaning inward, like they were closing in on the trail. At this point, I'm checking my phone constantly. It's still got battery, but no signal, and the compass app is going haywire, spinning in all directions. I start taking bigger steps, walking faster without actually running. I didn't want to admit to myself that I was scared, but my heart was pounding in my chest. Then I heard it, a rustling sound from somewhere behind me off to the right. Not the normal sound of an animal moving through underbrush. This was more deliberate. Stop, start, stop, start. Like something was moving only when I moved, trying to match my pace. I froze. The rustling stopped. I took a step. It took a step. I started walking faster, and the rustling kept pace. I told myself it was just an echo or my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was following me. The forest was getting darker now. Though my phone said it was only around 4 in the afternoon, the trees were blocking more light than they should have been able to. The air felt thick, almost hard to breathe, and it was still so quiet, except for that rustling that would start and stop with my movements. I came to a small clearing and stopped to catch my breath and try to get my bearings. That's when the feeling of being watched intensified so much I could physically feel it, like a pressure on the back of my neck. The rustling sounds were coming from multiple directions now, not just behind me, but to the sides as well, like I was being surrounded. I started moving again, no longer caring about finding the trail, just wanting to find any way out. The ground became more treacherous, rocks and roots seemingly appearing out of nowhere to trip me up. The trees were definitely closer together, forcing me to squeeze between them in some places. And then I fell. My foot caught on a root and I went down hard, scraping my palms and banging my knee on a rock. I lay there for a second, winded, before pushing myself up. That's when I saw it. About 30 yards away, partially hidden behind a massive oak tree, was a figure. Tall, taller than any person should be, at least 7 feet. Hunched over in a way that looked painful, with limbs that seemed too long and bent at odd angles. It was hard to make out details in the dimming light, but its shape was just wrong. Not human, not animal, something else entirely. It wasn't moving, just standing there watching me. I couldn't see its face clearly, thank God, but I had the distinct impression it was smiling. The air around it seemed darker, like it was sucking in the little remaining light. I ran. I didn't think, didn't plan, just scrambled to my feet and ran blindly through the trees. Branches whipped at my face and arms. I tripped multiple times, but kept pushing myself up, kept moving. The rustling behind me was louder now, no longer trying to be stealthy. Whatever it was chasing me. I remember glancing back once and seeing movement, not just the one tall figure, but smaller shapes darting between trees. Multiple things, moving in unison, closing in. My lungs were burning, my legs felt like lead, but pure terror kept me going. I had no idea which direction I was running. All I knew was that I needed to get away from those things. And then, miraculously, I saw a break in the trees ahead. I pushed myself harder, sprinting toward it with everything I had left. The rustling behind me grew frantic, like whatever was chasing me knew I was about to escape. I burst through the tree line and found myself on the shoulder of a road. I doubled over, gasping for breath, before turning to look back at the forest. The trees were still, seemingly innocent in the fading daylight. No sign of anything following me, but the silence was still there, that unnatural, heavy quiet. I stood there shaking, waiting for those things to emerge from the trees. Nothing came. After a minute, a car approached, headlights cutting through the growing darkness. I flagged it down frantically. The driver was an older man who looked concerned at my appearance, scratched up, wild-eyed, terrified. He asked if I'd been in an accident. I tried to explain what happened, but the words wouldn't come out right. I just asked him for a ride to the nearest town. He was kind enough to take me, though I could tell he thought I was either drunk or crazy. Here's the part that still haunts me. As we drove away, I looked back at the forest through the rear window. Just for a second, silhouetted against the trees, I saw that tall figure again, standing right at the edge of the forest, watching the car drive away. And I swear it raised one impossibly long arm, almost like it was waving goodbye. I later found out we were almost 8 miles from the Erskine Woods parking lot where I'd left my car. There's no way I could have hiked that far in that time, especially not while lost. It's like the forest itself moved around me, or like I was somehow transported deeper into it. I had a friend drive me back the next day to get my car. I couldn't bring myself to go near those trees again. I just waited in his car with the doors locked while he walked to my vehicle to make sure it was still there. I've tried researching Erskine Woods since then. There are a few vague mentions online of people feeling uneasy there or getting temporarily lost, but nothing like what I experienced. I'm afraid to tell anyone else because I know how it sounds, but I know what I saw. I know what followed me. I don't know what lives in those woods. I don't know if it can leave them, but sometimes, late at night, I hear rustling outside my bedroom window. Stop, start, stop, start. And I'm afraid that whatever it was, it followed me home.